The millionaire found his mother kneeling, scrubbing the floor in a luxury nursing home while crying, unaware of the truth behind her suffering. He was horrified when he discovered what was really happening. Marcus Anderson stared at the empty driveway of his childhood home, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel of his rental car. The pristine Victorian house stood silent, its windows dark and uninviting, a stark contrast to the warm, welcoming place he remembered. Something was wrong. His mother's prized rose garden, once the envy of the neighborhood, had withered into a tangle of thorny branches and dead leaves. He stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. The autumn wind carried a chill that seemed to penetrate his expensive suit, making him shiver despite the midday sun. 10 years. Had it really been that long since he'd last visited? The guilt gnawed at him, but he'd made sure to send money every month, more than enough for his mother to live comfortably. The neighbor's curtain twitched, and Mrs. Peterson's familiar face appeared. She had aged considerably, her once dark hair now completely white. Their eyes met, and she hurried outside, wringing her hands in her apron. "Marcus, is that really you?" Her voice trembled. "Oh, dear boy, we've been so worried." "Mrs. Peterson, where's my mother? Why isn't she home?" The old woman's face fell, her eyes filling with concern. "You don't know, but surely—" Thomas said, "He'd told you everything." Marcus's jaw clenched at the mention of his stepfather's name. "Told me what?" "Your mother. She's been at Silver Oaks for almost 2 years now, the assisted living facility on Maple Drive." Mrs. Peterson's voice dropped to a whisper. "Thomas said it was for the best, that she needed professional care, but something never felt right about it." The world seemed to tilt beneath Marcus's feet. Silver Oaks, the exclusive retirement community that charged more per month than most. People made in a year. His mother had always hated the idea of such places, calling them gilded cages for the elderly. "That's impossible," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Mrs. Peterson. "I've been sending money every month. She should be living here in her home." Mrs. Peterson touched his arm gently. "Dear, there's something else you should know. Your Uncle James has been visiting frequently, always with Thomas. They've made some changes to the house, and your mother's belongings. Many of them are gone." Marcus's blood ran cold. Uncle James, his father's brother, had never shown much interest in their family before. Why was he suddenly involved now? Without another word, Marcus strode back to his car. The drive to Silver Oaks took exactly 12 minutes, each second feeling like an eternity. The facility rose before him like a modern castle, all gleaming, glass and manicured lawns. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles, and a valet stepped forward to take his keys. "I'm here to see Elizabeth Anderson," Marcus announced at the reception desk, trying to keep his voice steady. The receptionist's perfectly manicured nails clacked against the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but Mrs. Anderson is not available for visitors at this time. She's—" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to something on her screen. "She's participating in our daily activities program." "I'm her son," Marcus said, his voice dropping dangerously low, "and I haven't seen her in 10 years. I suggest you tell me where she is right now." Something in his tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because the receptionist's professional smile faltered. "3rd floor, East Wing," she said quietly. "But sir, you should know—" Marcus was already walking away, his long strides eating up the distance to the elevator. The 3rd floor was eerily quiet, the thick carpeting muffling his footsteps. He followed the signs to the East Wing, his heart pounding with each step. And then he saw her. In a deserted hallway, a woman knelt on the floor, her grey hair falling forward as she scrubbed at a stubborn stain. Her hands were red and raw, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She wore a uniform, a cleaner's uniform, but Marcus would have recognized her anywhere. "Mom?" Elizabeth Anderson looked up, her tear-stained face frozen in shock. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the cleaning supplies clattered to the floor as she struggled to her feet, her hands trembling. "Marcus, my boy!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. She felt so small, so fragile, nothing like the strong, vibrant woman he remembered. The smell of cleaning chemicals clung to her clothes, replacing the familiar scent of her favorite lavender perfume. "What happened?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why are you here? Why are you cleaning floors?" His mother's fingers clutched at his suit jacket. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, "there's so much you don't know, so much I couldn't tell you. Thomas, he said if I tried to contact you, he'd make things so much worse. And your Uncle James, he—" Her voice caught on a sob. Marcus held her tighter, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple case of his stepfather's poor judgment. This was something far worse, a betrayal so deep it made his entire body cold with rage. "Tell me everything," he said softly, guiding her to a nearby bench. "Start from the beginning. And Mom?" He tilted her chin up, meeting her tearful eyes. "I'm not going anywhere this time, I promise." Elizabeth's hands shook as she smoothed her uniform, a habit Marcus remembered from his childhood, her way of gathering courage before facing difficult situations. The fluorescent lights of the hallway cast harsh shadows on her face, highlighting the new lines of worry that hadn't been there 10 years ago. "It started small," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "After you left to build your business, Thomas began suggesting I was becoming forgetful. He would move things around the house, then insist I had misplaced them. Your Uncle James would visit and agree with everything Thomas said, always speaking to me as if I were a child." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent, letting his mother continue. "Then the papers started appearing. Thomas would say they were just routine documents, insurance forms, bank statements, investment opportunities. He always caught me when I was tired or distracted, saying it was urgent to sign right away. I trusted him, Marcus. He was my husband, and James was your father's brother. How could I not trust them?" She paused, wiping a tear with the back of her hand. "One day I tried to withdraw money from our joint account, and the bank manager told me I no longer had access. Thomas had become my financial guardian, claiming I was experiencing cognitive decline. He had documents, medical evaluations I never remembered having, testimonies from concerned friends I'd never met." Marcus's hand curled into a fist. "The money I've been sending every month, diverted to accounts I couldn't access. Thomas used it to maintain his lifestyle while convincing everyone I needed to be here. He made a deal with the administration. They would keep me as a resident if I worked as part of the cleaning staff. He said it was therapeutic activity, but really it was their way of covering the costs while keeping up appearances." A nurse walked past, averting her eyes when she saw them. Marcus noticed how his mother seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible. "The other women here," Elizabeth continued, her voice stronger now. "Some of them are in similar situations. Sarah Johnson, she used to own a successful art gallery. Now she serves meals in the dining room because her nephew convinced everyone she was incompetent. Margaret Wells spends her days doing laundry while her children live in her house and spend her pension." Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing the hallway. "We're leaving right now." "It's not that simple," Elizabeth caught his hand. "Thomas has everything. The house, the cars, even Dad's old watch collection. He and James split everything between them. They have papers showing I willingly signed it all away." "Papers obtained through deception," Marcus growled. "Mom, I'm a business owner now. I know exactly how to fight this kind of fraud. But your work, that big merger you mentioned in your last email, you can't put everything on hold for this." Marcus knelt before his mother, taking her worn hands in. "Look at me. No business deal is more important than this. We're going to fight them, and we're going to win." A small spark of hope flickered in Elizabeth's eyes, the same determination he remembered from his childhood, when she'd worked 3 jobs to put him through school after his father's passing. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice further. "I've been keeping records, every document I could secretly photograph, every conversation I managed to record on my old phone. I knew someday I'd find a way to prove what they've done." Pride swelled in Marcus's chest. Even beaten down, his mother had never stopped fighting. "Mrs. Anderson," a sharp voice interrupted them. The floor supervisor, a stern-faced woman in an expensive suit, strode toward them. "This area needs to be cleaned before dinner service. You know the rules." Marcus rose to his full height, his presence suddenly filling the hallway. "The rules are about to change, ma'am. My mother won't be cleaning anything else in this facility, ever. Sir, I don't know who you are, but I'm Marcus Anderson, CEO of Anderson Global Ventures, and I'm removing my mother from this facility immediately. I suggest you cooperate, or the next people you speak to will be my lawyers. The supervisor's face paled. Mr. Anderson, there are procedures, legal requirements. Oh, we'll be dealing with legal requirements very soon, Marcus assured her, his voice steel cold. But right now, my mother is leaving with me, and tomorrow we begin dismantling this entire operation piece by piece. Elizabeth stood, her chin lifting slightly as she unpinned her name badge from the uniform. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again, not a victim, but a survivor. As they walked toward the elevator, she heard whispers from the other residents, saw hope dawning in their eyes. Marcus squeezed her hand. We're not just fighting for you, Mom, we're fighting for all of them. As the elevator doors closed behind them, Elizabeth looked at her son, really looked at him. The ambitious young man who'd left home had become something more, a warrior for justice, just like his father had been. And together, they were about to wage a war against those who thought they could steal not just money and property, but dignity and freedom from those they claimed to protect. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Marcus's penthouse suite at the Grand Plaza Hotel, where he had brought his mother the previous evening. Elizabeth sat at the breakfast table, looking small in one of the hotel's plush robes, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The simple act of wearing her own clothes again, clothes Marcus had bought for her last night, seemed to have restored some of her dignity. I've arranged for Richard Bennett to meet us here, Marcus said, setting down his phone. He was Dad's best friend and attorney for 20 years. If anyone can help us navigate this legally, it's him. Elizabeth nodded, a shadow crossing her face. Thomas and James will fight back hard, Marcus. They've had years to cover their tracks. Let them try, Marcus replied, his voice steady. We have something they don't, the truth. A knock at the door announced Richard Bennett's arrival. The veteran attorney had aged since Marcus last saw him, his hair now completely silver, but his sharp eyes hadn't changed a bit. When he saw Elizabeth, his professional demeanor cracked. My God, Liz, he whispered, taking in her appearance. When Marcus called, I couldn't believe what he was telling me. But seeing you now, Elizabeth managed a small smile. It's good to see you, Richard. Thank you for coming. They spent the next 2 hours going through Elizabeth's secret documentation. Her phone contained dozens of photos of legal documents, each one a piece of the puzzle showing how Thomas and James had systematically stripped her of everything. The timing is crucial, Richard said, examining a particularly damning document. See these dates? They started transferring assets just 3 months after Marcus left for Silicon Valley. They knew he was too busy building his company to check on things closely. Marcus's grip tightened on his coffee cup. They used my absence against her. There's more, Elizabeth said quietly, pulling out a small notebook from her purse. I kept track of conversations, dates, times. The administrator at Silver Oaks, Patricia Whitmore, she's involved too. I overheard her and Thomas discussing their arrangement one night when they thought everyone was asleep. Richard's eyebrows shot up as he read through the notebook. This is extraordinary, Liz. You've essentially built our case for us while they thought you were just another helpless victim. We'll need to move fast, Marcus interjected. Once they realize Mom's gone from Silver Oaks, they'll try to destroy evidence. As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Where is your mother? The facility called. You have no right to remove her without my permission as her legal guardian. Richard's eyes narrowed as he read the message. Perfect. He's already making mistakes. By admitting his role as guardian, he's opened the door for us to challenge the validity of that guardianship. Elizabeth suddenly sat up straighter. The safe, she said, her voice urgent. In Thomas's study, behind the Monet print. He keeps all his important papers there. I saw him access it once. The combination is my first husband's birthday. He thought it was ironic. Marcus and Richard exchanged looks. We need those documents, Richard said, but we have to be careful. If we're caught accessing the safe, we could compromise our entire case. I might have a solution, Marcus said, pulling out his laptop. Remember Claire, Thomas's former secretary who he fired last year? She reached out to me on LinkedIn a few months ago, hinting that she had information about irregularities in his business practices. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Elizabeth leaned forward. Claire was always kind to me. She used to slip me small treats when Thomas wasn't looking. I think she suspected something was wrong but was afraid to speak up. Marcus was already composing an email to Claire. We don't need her to break in or do anything illegal. We just need her testimony about what she witnessed and any documentation she might have kept. Richard nodded approvingly. Smart. Build the case methodically, piece by piece. Meanwhile, I'll file for an emergency injunction to freeze all the assets Thomas and James control. We need to prevent them from liquidating anything before we can prove fraud. A subtle change had come over Elizabeth as they talked. Her shoulders straightened and some of the fear left her eyes. All these years, she said softly, I kept wondering if I was really losing my mind like they said, if maybe they were right about me being incapable. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That was their biggest mistake, Mom. They underestimated you. They thought they could break your spirit. They nearly did, she admitted, but every time I felt like giving up, I would think of you, of your father, of everything we built together. I knew I had to keep fighting, keep gathering evidence even if I never found a way to use it. Richard closed his legal pad decisively. Well, now we're going to use every bit of it. I'll have the injunction filed within the hour. Marcus, can you get me access to your financial records, showing the transfers to Thomas? We'll need to trace exactly where that money went. As Richard packed up his briefcase, Elizabeth touched his arm. Richard, there are other women at Silver Oaks in the same situation. We can't forget about them. The attorney's face softened. Don't worry, Liz. By the time we're done, we'll expose the entire operation. No one else will suffer what you went through. After Richard left, Marcus noticed his mother staring out the window at the city below. What are you thinking about, Mom? About how strange life is, she replied. All those years, Thomas and James thought they were so clever, building their scheme bit by bit. They never realized they were actually building the evidence we'd use to bring them down. Every document they made me sign, every conversation they had thinking I was too broken to understand, it's all going to help us now. The response to Richard's injunction was swift and explosive. By noon, Thomas's lawyer had called Marcus 3 times, each message more threatening than the last. James had sent a lengthy email full of veiled threats and reminders about family loyalty, but it was the call from Patricia Whitmore, the Silver Oaks administrator, that truly revealed their desperation. Your mother is unwell, Mr. Anderson, Whitmore said, her professional voice strained. We've been managing her condition with great care. This disruption to her routine could be devastating. Marcus put the call on speaker so his mother could hear. Really, Ms. Whitmore, tell me, is forcing elderly residents to work as unpaid cleaning staff part of your therapeutic program? A telling pause. I don't know what Elizabeth has told you, but she's prone to confusion. We have extensive medical documentation, falsified documentation, Marcus cut in. Would you like to explain that to a judge, or shall we discuss a more amenable solution? The line went dead. Elizabeth looked at her son with a mixture of pride and anxiety. They're scared, she observed. I've never heard Patricia rattled like that before. Before Marcus could respond, his phone lit up with a text from Claire, Thomas's former secretary. Got your email. Have documents plus recordings. Can meet tomorrow. Be careful. T&J have friends in high places. The warning wasn't unexpected, but it added urgency to their timeline. Marcus forwarded the message to Richard, then turned to his mother. We should get you settled somewhere safer. They know we're in the city. Elizabeth straightened in her chair. No more hiding, she said firmly. That's what they want, for me to disappear again. Besides, we need to help the others. Mom, it's not safe. Sarah Johnson has 2 grandchildren. She hasn't seen in 3 years because her nephew convinced everyone she was incompetent, Elizabeth interrupted. Margaret Wells's children sold her art collection, pieces she spent decades collecting, and told her she imagined ever owning them. These women aren't just victims, Marcus. They're survivors, and they deserve justice too. Marcus studied. His mother's face, seeing the same determination that had gotten their family through the hardest times after his father's passing. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this smart. No unnecessary risks." A knock at the door made them both jump. Marcus approached cautiously, checking the security viewer. His tension melted when he saw who it was. Sarah Johnson stood in the hallway, still wearing her Silver Oaks cafeteria uniform. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her obvious anxiety, she carried herself with dignity. "Elizabeth texted me the hotel information," she explained as Marcus let her in. "I had to come as soon as my shift ended. Is it true? Are you really fighting back?" Elizabeth embraced her friend. "We are. And we have proof, Sarah. Real proof of what they've been doing." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened her large handbag. "Then you need to see these." She pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been collecting evidence too. Account statements showing suspicious transfers from my gallery's accounts. Emails between my nephew and Patricia Whitmore discussing their arrangement. I was an art dealer for 30 years. I know how to keep detailed records." Marcus and Elizabeth exchanged glances. This was bigger than they'd imagined. "There's a group of us," Sarah continued. "Women who've been gathering evidence, waiting for a chance to expose what's happening. We call ourselves the silent witnesses, because that's what they thought we were, silent, helpless, invisible. But we saw everything, we documented everything." Elizabeth touched the papers reverently. "How many of you are there?" 15 at Silver Oaks alone. And we have contacts at other facilities. Once we started looking, we found similar patterns everywhere. Children or relatives gaining guardianship through deception, working with corrupt facility administrators to exploit vulnerable seniors. Marcus had been typing rapidly on his laptop. "Richard needs to see this immediately. If we can prove it's a systematic operation, it could become a class action," Sarah finished. "I may have been an art dealer, but my son was a lawyer before." She paused, pain flickering across her face. "Before my nephew convinced him I was losing my mind and needed to be protected from myself." A new fire had lit in Elizabeth's eyes. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," she said softly. "We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's had their lives stolen by people they trusted." Marcus watched the two women bend over the documents, their voices growing stronger as they shared their stories and strategies. His mother was right. This was about more than their family now. It was about justice for an entire community of people who had been betrayed, manipulated, and hidden away. His phone buzzed again, another message from Thomas, this one attempting a different approach. "Marcus, son, let's discuss this reasonably. There's no need for lawyers. Come to the house tomorrow, we can work something out." Marcus showed the message to his mother, who read it with a grim smile. "He always did underestimate everyone around him," she said. "He never believed we could be strong enough to fight back." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's been their biggest mistake with all of us. They thought age made us weak, that fear would keep us quiet. They never understood that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who have nothing left to lose." The early morning meeting with Claire took place in a quiet corner of the botanical gardens, far from curious eyes and listening ears. The former secretary had aged visibly since Marcus last saw her, worry lines etched deeply around her mouth. She clutched a leather messenger bag close to her chest as she approached their bench. "I've been waiting for this moment for 2 years, Claire said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew someone would eventually see through their facade. I just didn't expect it to be you, Marcus. They were so confident you'd never look too closely." Marcus gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Tell me everything, Claire. What did you witness?" Claire's fingers nervously played with the clasp of her bag. "It started with small things. Thomas would have me prepare documents for Elizabeth to sign, always insisting it was urgent, always when she was distracted or tired. James would visit the office and they'd have these long meetings behind closed doors. But the walls were thin, and I could hear them laughing about how easy it was." She pulled out a small digital recorder from her bag. "I started recording their conversations. Not every day, I had to be careful, but enough. They never suspected. The quiet middle-aged secretary would be a threat. That was their pattern, you see, underestimating women they viewed as beneath them. The recordings were damning. Thomas and James discussing how to manipulate medical evaluations, strategizing ways to isolate Elizabeth from her friends, planning the transfer of assets with cold efficiency. But it was the conversation about Silver Oaks that made Marcus's blood run cold. "It's the perfect solution," Thomas's voice crackled through the speaker. "Patricia Whitmore runs a tight ship. She knows how to keep troublesome residents in line. A little manual labor builds character, doesn't it, James?" James's laughter followed. "And the monthly payments from Marcus go straight into our accounts. The boy's so busy with his empire he'll never know. By the time he figures it out, if he ever does, everything will be legally ours." Claire stopped the recording, her hands shaking slightly. "There's more, much more. I kept copies of every suspicious document, noted every unusual transaction. When they caught me documenting things I shouldn't have seen, Thomas fired me immediately. But he didn't know I'd already secured the evidence." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Marcus asked gently. "Fear," Claire admitted. "They have connections everywhere, judges, doctors, law enforcement. They made it clear what would happen to anyone who tried to expose them. But now, with you involved," she straightened her shoulders, "I'm ready to testify about everything." Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from Richard Bennett. "Emergency. Thomas is trying to sell the house. Paperwork just filed. Need to move fast." Claire saw the change in Marcus's expression. "They're panicking," she observed. "Good. That's when people make mistakes. We need to get these recordings to Richard. Immediately," Marcus said, standing. "Claire, I know I'm asking a lot, but would you be willing to meet with him today? Your testimony could be crucial." "I'll do more than that," Claire replied, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "These are photographs I took of their private files, account numbers, transaction records, everything. I've been carrying them with me for 2 years, waiting for the right moment. There's something else you should know, too. Thomas and James? They've done this before." Marcus froze. "What do you mean?" "Before your mother, there were others, 3 other women, all wealthy widows. I found the records hidden in their private files. Each time they followed the same pattern: marriage, isolation, financial manipulation, then institutionalization. 2 of the women passed away while in care facilities. The third vanished. Completely. I could never find out what happened to her." A chill ran down Marcus's spine despite the warm morning sun. "We need to get this information to the police." "Already handled," came a new voice. Sarah Johnson stepped out from behind a nearby tree, her art dealer's eye for timing still impeccable. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Elizabeth thought you might need backup. I have a friend in the white-collar crimes division. He's been building a case against Thomas and James for months, but didn't have enough evidence to move forward. Until now." Claire's eyes widened. "The silent witnesses?" Sarah nodded. "We've heard about you, Claire. Your name comes up in our investigations. We've been hoping you'd find a way to come forward." Marcus looked between the 2 women, a new understanding dawning. The network of resistance was larger and more organized than he'd imagined. While Thomas and James had been building their empire of exploitation, their victims had been quietly building something too, an underground network of witnesses, survivors, and allies. "There's a meeting tonight," Sarah continued. "The full group of silent witnesses plus some key allies. Elizabeth will be there. We'd like both of you to come. It's time to coordinate our efforts to make sure no evidence slips through the cracks." Claire clutched her messenger bag tighter. "Where?" "The old library on Maple Street. They closed it last year, but Margaret Wells, one of our members, has a key. She was on the library board before her children took control of her life. We meet in the rare books room. The irony doesn't escape us, using a room full of precious things that people overlooked as our base of operations." Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another urgent message from Richard. The house sale was moving forward faster than expected. They needed to act now. "I'll be there," he promised. "But first I need to stop my stepfather from selling my mother's house out from under us." Sarah's expression hardened. "Go, we'll handle things here. And Marcus, remember, you're not just fighting for Elizabeth anymore. You're fighting for all of us. Every woman they've silenced, every life they've stolen. Make them regret ever thinking we were too weak to fight back." The rare books room of the old Maple Street Library still smelled of leather and history, its dark wood panels absorbing the soft light from antique reading lamps. By 8 o'clock that evening, the space had filled with an extraordinary gathering. Women of various ages sat in a circle, their faces bearing the same mixture of determination and carefully contained anger. Elizabeth, now dressed in a simple but elegant blazer, sat between Sarah and Margaret Wells, her back straight, her eyes alert. Marcus stood slightly apart, watching in amazement as more people arrived. Claire settled into a corner with her messenger bag, while Richard Bennett set up a small recording device to document the meeting. A distinguished-looking man in a police detective's badge introduced himself as Jack Morrison, Sarah's contact from the white-collar crimes unit. "Ladies," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of her gallery owner days, "we have a unique opportunity. Thanks to Marcus and Claire, we now have concrete evidence of Thomas and James's operations. Detective Morrison believes we can build a case that will not only bring them to justice, but expose the entire network of corrupt facilities and administrators." Margaret Wells, a tall woman with aristocratic features, leaned forward. "We need to move carefully. I've been tracking similar cases across 3 states. It's not just Thomas and James. There's a whole network of predators targeting vulnerable seniors, particularly women with substantial assets." "They're organized," Elizabeth added, her voice stronger than Marcus had heard it in days. "They share information, strategies, even legal resources. That's why it's been so hard to fight them individually." Detective Morrison nodded grimly. "We've suspected this for years, but proving it has been nearly impossible. The victims are often isolated, their credibility deliberately undermined. The perpetrators are careful to maintain a veneer of legality. But they made a mistake this time," Claire spoke up from her corner. "They got sloppy, overconfident. I have recordings of them discussing their entire operation." A murmur ran through the group. Another woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Helen Parker, raised her hand. "I was a geriatric psychiatrist before my son had me declared incompetent. I've been gathering evidence of falsified medical evaluations, not just from Silver Oaks, but from 5 other facilities in the network." Marcus watched in awe as more women came forward, each contributing another piece to the puzzle. One had been a bank executive, methodically documenting suspicious financial patterns. Another had been a social worker, recording cases of elder exploitation that had been mysteriously dismissed by the courts. "The question is timing," Richard said, his legal pad now full of notes. "Thomas is trying to sell Elizabeth's house. Once that's done, he'll start liquidating other assets. We need to move before he can hide the money." "We have something else to consider," Sarah interjected. "Many of the women still trapped in these facilities are in declining health. The longer we wait, the fewer survivors will be left to testify." Elizabeth stood up, commanding attention without raising her voice. "Then we move now, all of us together. They've relied on keeping us isolated, making each of us think we were alone. But look around this room. Look at what we've built right under their noses." Marcus stepped forward. "I can help with resources. My company has connections, influence." "No," Elizabeth interrupted gently. "You have a bigger role to play, son. Thomas and James still think you're just a concerned son who can be manipulated or bought off. Let them keep thinking that while we mobilize the entire network." Detective Morrison checked his watch. "I can have a task force ready within 48 hours, but we'll need every piece of evidence, every witness statement properly documented." "Already done," Dr. Parker said, pulling out a USB drive. "We may be trapped in these facilities, but we've had years to prepare. Every silent witness has been keeping records, waiting for this moment." The energy in the room had shifted from anger to purpose. These women, dismissed as confused or incompetent, had created something remarkable, an underground resistance movement that had methodically gathered evidence while their oppressors celebrated their apparent victory. "There's one more thing," Margaret Wells said, her voice cutting through the quiet discussions. "We need to think about the future. After we expose this network, there will be other women who need help, other predators who think they can exploit the vulnerable." Elizabeth's eyes met her son's across the room. "We'll build something new," she said firmly, "a foundation to protect others, to make sure no one has to fight this battle alone again. As the meeting continued into the night, Marcus watched these extraordinary women planning their counterattack with precision and courage. His mother had transformed from a victim to a leader, her quiet strength inspiring others to stand with her. His phone buzzed, another threatening message from Thomas about the house sale. But now, looking at the assembled force in this room, Marcus felt only anticipation. Let them try their worst. They had no idea what was coming for them, no conception of the power they had created by underestimating these remarkable women. The war was about to begin, and for the first time Marcus knew with absolute certainty that justice would prevail. The next morning dawned with an unexpected twist. Thomas and James had made their first major mistake. They'd attempted to rush the house sale through an old friend at the county clerk's office, bypassing normal procedures. But Richard Bennett had anticipated this move, and Judge Maria Collins, another silent ally of the silent witnesses, was waiting. "The emergency injunction is granted," Judge Collins declared in her chambers, her steel-grey eyes fixed on Thomas's lawyer. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a complete audit of all assets currently under Mr. Harrison's control as guardian." Marcus watched his stepfather's face turn an interesting shade of purple. Thomas Harrison had always cultivated an image of sophisticated control, but now his expensive suit seemed to suffocate him as he pulled at his collar. "This is absurd," Thomas sputtered. "I've been protecting Elizabeth's interests for years. Ask anyone at Silver Oaks. They'll confirm her condition requires careful management." "Interesting. You should mention Silver Oaks," Richard said smoothly, pulling out a thick folder. "We have some rather compelling documentation about their unique approach to elder care." James, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Your Honor, this is a family matter. My nephew is clearly being misled by his mother's confused recollections." "Enough!" Judge Collins's voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Anderson, is your mother available to speak for herself?" Elizabeth stepped forward from where she had been sitting quietly in the back of the chambers. She wore a tailored navy suit that Sarah had helped her choose, her silver hair elegantly styled. Nothing about her appearance suggested confusion or incompetence. "I am, Your Honor," she said clearly, "and I have quite a story to tell about what's been happening at Silver Oaks." For the next hour, Elizabeth methodically laid out the evidence of her exploitation. She presented her secret recordings, her documented observations, and the testimony of other residents. As she spoke, Marcus noticed something remarkable. Thomas and James's expressions had shifted from confidence to concern to barely concealed panic. "Furthermore," Elizabeth continued, "I'm not alone. There are 15 other women at Silver Oaks alone who have similar stories. Dr. Helen Parker, formerly Chief of Geriatric Medicine at Memorial Hospital, can testify about the falsified medical evaluations. Margaret Wells, who served on the State Arts Council, has documented evidence of systematic financial exploitation." Judge Collins's expression grew progressively darker. "Mr. Bennett, are you prepared to file criminal charges?" "Already in process, Your Honor. Detective Morrison from White Collar Crimes is building a case as we speak, but our immediate concern is protecting the assets that rightfully belong to Mrs. Anderson and the other victims." "Victims?" Thomas attempted a laugh that came out more like a cough. "Elizabeth has been well cared for. We made sure she had the best cleaning supplies," Marcus interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "The best mop to scrub floors. With the best schedule of unpaid labor disguised as therapy." James stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. We've done nothing illegal. Everything was properly documented, by coercion and deception," Elizabeth finished, "and we can prove it. Claire stepped into the chambers, carrying her messenger bag. Thomas's face went ash white. "What is she doing here?" "Telling the truth," Claire replied, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "About everything I witnessed in your office, about the conversations I recorded, about the pattern you and James established with other wealthy widows before Elizabeth." Judge Collins held up a hand. "Ms. Wilson, are you willing to provide sworn testimony about these allegations?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've already given my full statement to Detective Morrison. I also have copies of documents showing systematic fraud across multiple cases. Thomas's lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, any recordings made without my client's knowledge would be inadmissible. In criminal court, perhaps, Judge Collins cut in. But this is a civil hearing regarding guardianship and asset protection. I'm well within my authority to consider all available evidence when determining if Mr. Harrison has breached his fiduciary duties. She turned to Elizabeth. Mrs. Anderson, do you wish to have your son Marcus appointed as your guardian instead? Elizabeth stood straighter. No, Your Honor, I wish to have my independence restored. I am fully capable of managing my own affairs, as the genuine medical evaluation I underwent yesterday confirms. Dr. Sandra Chen from the University Medical Center has submitted her findings for your review. Marcus watched pride bloom across Richard's face. They had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. The silent witnesses had taught them well. Very well, Judge Collins said, reviewing Dr. Chen's report. Pending the full hearing next week, I'm temporarily suspending Mr. Harrison's guardianship and freezing all contested assets. Mr. Harrison and Mr. Anderson, James Anderson, are hereby ordered to provide a full accounting of every transaction made on Elizabeth's behalf within 48 hours. Thomas's lawyer began to object, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing either of you from contacting Mrs. Anderson or approaching her residence, and I'm ordering an immediate investigation into Silver Oaks Assisted Living Facility. She fixed Thomas with a stern glare. I suggest you both retain criminal defense attorneys. You're going to need them. As they left the chambers, Marcus noticed his mother walking taller, her steps lighter. The silent witnesses who had accompanied them, Sarah, Margaret, and Dr. Parker, gathered around her protectively. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. The story broke in the evening news. Prestigious senior living facility under investigation for exploitation. Patricia Whitmore's carefully crafted image of Silver Oaks as a haven for wealthy seniors began to crumble as more residents came forward with their stories. In the temporary office they'd set up in Marcus's hotel suite, Elizabeth and the core group of silent witnesses worked tirelessly to coordinate their responses. Sarah Johnson handled media inquiries with the same grace she'd once used to sell million-dollar paintings. Margaret Wells organized the documentation with military precision, while Dr. Parker prepared detailed analyses of the falsified medical reports. Channel 7 wants to interview you, Elizabeth, Sarah announced, lowering her phone. They're calling it a senior spring, how elderly residents organized to fight back against systematic exploitation. Elizabeth looked up from the stack of papers she was reviewing. What do you think, Marcus? Is it time to go public? Before Marcus could respond, his phone lit up with an incoming call from Singapore. The merger he'd been negotiating for months, the deal that would have doubled his company's value, needed an answer within 24 hours. Take it, Elizabeth said softly, reading his expression. We can handle things here. Marcus stepped onto the balcony, the evening air cool against his face. Mr. Chen, his potential partner in Singapore, was direct as always. Marcus, the board is getting nervous. This scandal with your family, it's drawing attention we don't need. Perhaps we should postpone until things settle down. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't hide the underlying threat. Marcus looked through the glass doors at his mother and her allies, these remarkable women who had refused to be silenced. The merger would have to wait. Mr. Chen, he said firmly, family comes first. I need to see this through. The deal may not be available later, Chen warned. Then I'll build something new, something better. Marcus ended the call feeling lighter despite the billions he'd just potentially walked away from. When he returned inside, he found the group gathered around Claire's laptop, watching footage from Silver Oaks security cameras that Detective Morrison had obtained through a warrant. Look, Dr. Parker pointed at the screen. 3 different residents being forced to work night shifts, all of them wealthy women whose assets were under guardian control. Patricia Whitmore supervised personally. We've identified 37 cases so far, Margaret added, consulting her meticulous notes. Not just at Silver Oaks, but at connected facilities in 3 states. The same pattern repeats. wealthy. Women isolated from their families, stripped of their assets, forced into unpaid labor under the guise of therapy. Elizabeth touched the screen gently. "Barbara Reynolds," she said softly. "She used to help me clean the third floor. She was a retired judge before her nephew took control of her estate. She isn't with us anymore." The room fell silent, remembering those who hadn't survived to see justice. Sarah's phone buzzed with another media request. "They want to know if we'll participate in a documentary, Breaking the Silence, the Silver Oaks Scandal." "Yes," Elizabeth said firmly. "The world needs to know. Not just about Silver Oaks, but about all of it. How predators target vulnerable seniors, how the system is rigged against us, how we fought back." Marcus watched his mother's transformation with awe. The woman who had been forced to scrub floors was now helping to reshape the national conversation about elder abuse and exploitation. A knock at the door revealed Richard Bennett with fresh news. "Thomas and James are trying to cut a deal with the prosecutor's office. They're offering to testify against Patricia Whitmore and the larger network in exchange for leniency." "They're turning on each other," Claire observed with grim satisfaction, "just like they turned on every woman they exploited." Elizabeth shook her head. "No deals. They need to face the full consequences of their actions, for Barbara, for all the others, who can't speak for themselves anymore." The group worked late into the night, preparing for the next day's challenges. Marcus ordered dinner for everyone, watching as these extraordinary women strategized and supported each other. His mother had found more than allies. She had found a new purpose, a mission that would help protect others from experiencing what she had endured. As the others began to leave, Elizabeth stood by the window looking out at the city lights. "You know what I realized today?" she said to Marcus as he joined her. "They thought they were breaking us, but they were actually making us stronger. Every woman they hurt became part of our network. Every story they tried to silence became part of our testimony." Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. "The silent witnesses aren't so silent anymore." "No," Elizabeth smiled. "And we never will be again. Tomorrow we tell our story to the world, not just for ourselves, but for every person who's ever been told they're too old, too weak, or too confused to fight back." The city sparkled below them, a testament to the power of light breaking through darkness. In just a few days, they had begun to dismantle a network of exploitation that had operated unchecked for years. But more importantly, they had given voice to those who had been silenced, strength to those who had been weakened, and hope to those who had lost everything but their will to fight. The media storm that followed Elizabeth's television interview exceeded all expectations. Her poised demeanor and articulate presentation of the evidence left no doubt about her competency, while her compassionate inclusion of other victims' stories transformed the narrative from a personal scandal to a national crusade. "We're receiving calls from across the country," Sarah announced during their morning strategy session. "Other families recognizing the same patterns, other facilities operating similar schemes. This is bigger than we imagined." Elizabeth sat at the head of the conference table they'd set up in Marcus's expanded suite. The hotel had given them a larger space to accommodate their growing operation, and the room buzzed with activity as volunteers, many of them relatives of other victims, worked to document new cases. "Patricia Whitmore is trying to distance herself from Thomas and James," Detective Morrison reported, joining them with fresh coffee and a thick folder. "She's offering to provide internal documents showing they were the masterminds behind the entire operation." "Classic deflection," Dr. Parker noted, reviewing the latest batch of medical records. "But she's just as culpable. I found her signature on dozens of falsified evaluations, not just at Silver Oaks, but at 3 other facilities." Marcus watched the interaction with growing admiration. These women had created an efficient investigative unit, each contributing their professional expertise to strengthen their case. His mother, once forced to clean in silence, now coordinated their efforts with natural leadership. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Claire burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this," she said, turning. On the television, the news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news in the Silver Oaks scandal. James Anderson, one of the key figures in the alleged exploitation scheme, has agreed to a full confession." Sources say he's providing evidence of similar operations in multiple states, implicating several prominent figures in the healthcare and legal communities. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, but Elizabeth remained calm. "He's trying to save himself," she observed. "Just like always. James never could handle pressure." "This could work in our favor," Richard said, already making notes. "His confession will make it harder for Thomas to maintain his innocence, and it could help. First, identify other perpetrators." Before they could discuss further, Marcus's phone rang. It was his executive assistant, Amanda, with urgent news about his company. "Sir, the board is calling an emergency meeting. With the scandal getting national attention, some members are concerned about the impact on our corporate image. They're suggesting a temporary leave of absence." Marcus felt all eyes in the room turn to him. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when his personal crusade for justice would collide with his professional responsibilities. The company he'd built from scratch, his life's work, was now at risk. Elizabeth touched his arm gently. "Son, if you need to step back—" "No," Marcus said firmly, both to his mother and into the phone. "Amanda, schedule the board meeting for tomorrow morning. In person, not virtual. And prepare the Phillips documentation." After ending the call, he turned to the group. "The Phillips case was our company's first major success. We exposed corporate fraud that was hurting thousands of small investors. It's what put us on the map." He smiled grimly. "If the board wants to discuss image concerns, we'll remind them what our company stands for." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Speaking of image, we've received requests for Elizabeth to speak at 3 major conferences on elder rights. The advocacy community is mobilizing around this issue." "We'll need to be careful," Margaret cautioned. "Thomas still has allies. This morning, I received a call from an investment advisor offering to help me resolve my financial difficulties if I'd consider withdrawing from the case." "They're getting desperate," Detective Morrison said. "We've traced large transfers from accounts controlled by Thomas to offshore banks. He's trying to hide assets before the full investigation hits." Elizabeth stood, commanding attention without raising her voice. "Let them try. Every desperate move, every attempt at intimidation just proves what we've been saying. They thought they could silence us with threats and manipulation. They thought age made us weak, that isolation made us powerless." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. But they forgot something important. Wisdom comes with age, and there's strength in numbers. A young intern rushed in with fresh prints of financial records. "Dr. Parker, we found something in the Silver Oaks accounts. There's a pattern of unusual payments to a company called Sunset Consulting. We traced it back to—" "James," Claire finished, recognition flashing across her face. "I remember those invoices. They always came through a special channel, marked for immediate processing." Marcus watched as the group mobilized around this new lead, their efficiency born from years of careful observation and documentation. His mother had taught them well, how to gather evidence quietly, how to connect seemingly unrelated details, how to build a case so strong it could withstand any attack. "We go public with James's confession tomorrow," Elizabeth decided. "But we hold back the offshore account information. Let Thomas think he's still one step ahead." She turned to Marcus. "How long will your board meeting take?" "No more than 2 hours. Why?" A familiar glint appeared in Elizabeth's eyes, the same determination he remembered from his childhood when she'd worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat. "Because tomorrow afternoon we're going to Silver Oaks. It's time the residents still trapped there know they're not alone anymore. It's time they see what strength looks like." The room hummed with renewed purpose. They had started this fight to save one woman's dignity, but it had grown into something far more significant. They were no longer just seeking justice. They were sparking a revolution in how society treats its most vulnerable members. The board meeting at Anderson Global Ventures started exactly as Marcus had anticipated. The members, joining both in person and virtually, wore expressions of carefully contained concern as they discussed the public relations implications of his involvement in the Silver Oaks scandal. "This is a delicate situation," Vernon Mills, the lead director, began. "While we sympathize with your family matters, the company's reputation is built on fighting exactly this kind of exploitation," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady. He opened the Phillips case file, distributing copies to each board member. 10 years ago, we stood up against corporate fraud because it was the right thing to do. It wasn't just good ethics, it became the foundation of our success. The room fell silent as the board members reviewed the documents. Marcus pressed his advantage. Now we have an opportunity to stand up again, to show that our commitment to justice isn't just a marketing slogan. The Silver Oaks case isn't just about my mother. It's about systematic exploitation of vulnerable people across the country. Before anyone could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Sarah. James's confession is hitting the news. Turn on CNN now. He grabbed the remote, and the boardroom's massive screen came to life. James Anderson's face filled the screen, his usual arrogance replaced by nervous tension, as he detailed years of systematic fraud. It wasn't just Silver Oaks, James was saying. There are facilities like this in every state, targeting wealthy seniors, especially women. Thomas, Harrison, and we perfected the system. But we weren't the only ones. There are judges, lawyers, doctors all involved in this network. The board members watched in stunned silence as James continued his confession, implicating prominent figures across the healthcare and legal industries. When the broadcast ended, Vernon Mills cleared his throat. I believe we may have been hasty in our concerns. Mr. Anderson, please convey our support to your mother. And if there's anything the company can do to assist in this investigation. Marcus smiled. Actually, there is. We have a foundation to build. Meanwhile, across town, Elizabeth led a different kind of meeting. The main hall of Silver Oaks was filled with residents, their families, and members of the press. Patricia Whitmore was conspicuously absent, having taken an emergency leave of absence that morning. For years they told us we were confused. Elizabeth addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear. They said we needed protection from ourselves, but who was protecting us from them? She gestured to Sarah, Margaret, and Dr. Parker, who stood proudly beside her. We protected ourselves. We watched, we documented, we waited. And now we're taking back our power. The residents listened intently as Elizabeth outlined the evidence they'd gathered. The financial fraud, the forced labor, the falsified medical reports. With each revelation, more people stood up, ready to share their own stories. A small woman in the back raised her hand. I was a bank executive for 30 years, she said, her voice shaking. When my nephew took control of my assets, I started tracking the numbers. I knew something was wrong, but they told me I was paranoid. You weren't paranoid, Dr. Parker assured her. You were right, and now we can prove it. As the meeting continued, Claire worked with Detective Morrison in a corner, organizing the flood of new testimony and evidence. The detective's phone buzzed continuously, with updates from other jurisdictions launching their own investigations. Thomas's lawyer just called, Morrison reported quietly to Elizabeth. He wants to discuss a plea deal. Elizabeth shook her head. No deals. Not after what they did to Barbara, to all the others who didn't survive to see this day. The atmosphere in the room shifted as more residents gained the courage to speak out. A former teacher described how her children had conspired with facility administrators to seize her retirement funds. A retired nurse revealed how she'd been forced to work in the facility's medical office without pay. Marcus arrived just as the meeting was reaching its peak. He slipped in quietly, watching his mother in her element. Not a victim seeking justice, but a leader empowering others to reclaim their dignity. We're not just fighting for ourselves, Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. We're fighting for every person who's been told they're too old to matter, too weak to fight back. We're fighting for those who aren't here to fight for themselves anymore. She paused, making eye contact with various members of the audience. The silent witnesses aren't silent anymore, and we're building something new, a foundation that will help others fight back, that will provide legal support, advocacy, and protection for vulnerable seniors across the country. Marcus stepped forward then, joining his mother at the podium. Anderson Global Ventures is proud to announce its full support for the Silent Witnesses Foundation. We're committing significant resources to help expose and fight elder exploitation nationwide. The room erupted in applause. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. Today marks a new beginning. But remember, our strength isn't just in our resources or our evidence. Our strength is in our unity, in our refusal to be silenced, in our determination to protect each other. As the meeting concluded, residents and their families lined up to share their stories and join the growing movement. The silent witnesses had become a beacon of hope, their victory at Silver Oaks inspiring others to speak out against exploitation. Elizabeth stood with Marcus, watching as Claire and Detective Morrison gathered statements from new witnesses. "You know," she said softly, "when I was cleaning floors here, I used to imagine this day. Not just winning our freedom, but helping others win theirs too." Marcus squeezed her hand. "You did more than win freedom, Mom. You started a revolution." The headlines splashed across every major news outlet. Senior care scandal expands. Nationwide network of elder exploitation exposed. Elizabeth's story had sparked a movement that was now spreading like wildfire across the country. But with increased visibility came increased risk. In the secure conference room of their expanded headquarters, now occupying an entire floor of the Grand Plaza Hotel, Elizabeth and the core team of silent witnesses reviewed the latest developments with growing concern. "Thomas's associates are getting nervous," Detective Morrison reported, spreading photographs across the table. "We've identified board members from 12 different care facilities trying to leave the country. Their paper trails all lead back to Sunset Consulting." Sarah Johnson, who had been monitoring the financial records, looked up from her laptop. "The money transfers are accelerating. They're trying to hide assets faster than we can track them." Elizabeth studied the complex web of transactions displayed on the screens around them. Her years of quiet observation at Silver Oaks had taught her to see patterns others might miss. "Look at these dates," she said, pointing to a series of transfers. "They align perfectly with new resident admissions. Every time a wealthy senior was brought in under suspicious circumstances." "The money moved through their network," Marcus finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "They weren't just targeting individuals, they had a system." Claire, who had been cross-referencing admission records, nodded grimly. "I found something else. Every facility in their network used the same law firm for guardianship proceedings. Guess who sits on the firm's executive board?" "James," Elizabeth said softly. "My brother-in-law was their legal architect." The room fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. This wasn't just about Silver Oaks or Thomas's greed. They had stumbled upon an organized enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for years. Dr. Parker cleared her throat. "We need to move carefully. I've been analyzing the medical records of former residents who didn't survive their stay in these facilities. There's a pattern of neglect disguised as natural decline." Before anyone could respond, Marcus's phone lit up with an urgent message. His face tightened as he read it. "Thomas is making his move. He just called an emergency press conference. He's going to try to discredit the whole investigation." "Let him try," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "We have something he doesn't, the truth." But Margaret Wells, who had been unusually quiet, raised a hand. "There's more. My sources inside Silver Oaks say Patricia Whitmore isn't really on leave. She's been meeting with other facility administrators, coordinating their response. They're planning to claim that all resident labor was part of an approved therapeutic program." Elizabeth stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. The same city where just weeks ago she had been scrubbing floors in silence. "They still think they can control the narrative," she said, turning back to face the room. "Because that's what they've always done. Controlled how the world sees us, how we see ourselves." Marcus watched his mother, seeing not the vulnerable woman Thomas had tried to break, but a leader who had turned her pain into purpose. "What's our next move?" A small smile played at Elizabeth's lips. "We give them exactly what they want. A bigger stage to tell their lies, because this time we're ready." She moved to the central table, spreading out the evidence they'd gathered. "Sarah, call your media contacts. We want maximum coverage. Of Thomas's press conference. Claire, prepare all the documentation showing the real meaning of those therapeutic programs. Dr. Parker, get your analysis of the medical records ready." "You're going to let him make his accusations?" Detective Morrison asked, concerned. Better than that, Elizabeth replied. We're going to let him perjure himself on national television, because right after he finishes his performance, we're going to release everything. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence we've gathered. Marcus understood the strategy. We're not just exposing the fraud anymore, we're showing the world how they try to cover it up. Elizabeth nodded. The silent witnesses have been gathering evidence for years. While they thought we were just confused old women, we were documenting every lie, every manipulation, every abuse of power. Now it's time to show exactly how clear-minded we really are. The room buzzed with renewed energy as the team mobilized. Sarah coordinated with journalists, ensuring maximum coverage. Margaret organized the residents who were willing to speak. Out, Dr. Parker prepared her medical analysis, while Claire assembled the financial records that would expose the entire network. There's something else, Elizabeth added, her voice softening. Barbara Reynolds kept a diary before she left. Hers, she gave it to me for safekeeping. It documents everything she witnessed as a former judge, how the legal system was manipulated, how vulnerable seniors were targeted, how families were deceived. The room fell silent. Barbara's name had become a rallying cry for their cause, a reminder of why their fight mattered. Thomas thinks he can spin this story his way, Elizabeth continued. He thinks he can paint us as confused, elderly troublemakers who don't understand what's best for us. But Barbara understood everything, and now, through her words, she'll finally get to testify. As the team prepared for the coming confrontation, Marcus noticed something different about the silent witnesses. The fear that had once haunted their eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. These women, who had been systematically stripped of their power, had discovered something their oppressors hadn't counted on: the strength that comes from standing together, the courage that builds when truth finally finds its voice. The next 24 hours would change everything. Thomas and his allies were about to learn a painful lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you've taught to be silent. The press conference room at the Meridian Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Thomas Harrison, impeccably dressed, in his signature charcoal suit, stood at the podium with the confident smile of a man who believed he still controlled the narrative. James, conspicuously absent, had been carefully excluded from this performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice smooth as silk, "I stand before you today to address the unfortunate misunderstandings that have led to these baseless accusations. Silver Oaks and its partner facilities have always operated with the highest standards of care. In a hotel room 12 floors above, Elizabeth and the silent witnesses watched the broadcast intently. Their own press conference was scheduled to begin exactly 15 minutes after Thomas finished his statement. "Notice his body language," Dr. Parker observed, "the way he keeps adjusting his tie, how his left hand twitches slightly. Classic signs of stress leaking through a practiced facade." Sarah was coordinating with news stations via tablet, ensuring their response would receive equal coverage. All major networks are standing by. They're intrigued by our promise of revelatory evidence. On screen, Thomas continued his carefully crafted story. These therapeutic work programs were designed by medical professionals to provide structure and purpose. Any suggestion of exploitation is not only false, but deeply offensive to the dedicated staff who— "Dedicated staff like me?" Claire muttered, organizing the final set of documents. "The ones he fired for asking too many questions." Elizabeth sat quietly, watching her former husband spin his web of lies. She thought of Barbara Reynolds, of all the others who hadn't lived to see this day. Her hands rested on Barbara's diary, their secret weapon, the testimony of a respected judge that would shatter Thomas's credibility. "My primary concern has always been protecting vulnerable seniors from their own impaired judgment," Thomas continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "When Elizabeth began showing signs of confusion, making questionable financial decisions—" Marcus tensed, but his mother placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let him finish," she said softly. "Every lie he tells now makes our evidence stronger." As Thomas concluded his statement, the reporters began their questions. Elizabeth nodded to Sarah, who sent their prepared documents to every major news outlet simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Reporters at the press conference began receiving alerts on their phones, their expressions changing as they scanned the evidence. "Mr. Harrison," one journalist called out, "how do you respond to these records showing systematic financial fraud across multiple facilities?" Thomas faltered for the first time. "I'm not aware of any such records." "We have documentation of your meetings with Patricia Whitmore," another reporter pressed, "specifically discussing how to use resident labor to offset costs. Can you explain these conversations?" The confident smile slipped further. "Those conversations are being taken out of context." Elizabeth stood, straightening her jacket. "It's time." The team moved with practiced efficiency, taking the service elevator to the conference room 2 floors below, where their own media event was set up. As they entered through the back, they could hear the commotion from Thomas's press conference being broadcast on the monitors. "You've all received the initial documentation," Elizabeth began as she took the podium, her voice strong and clear. "But there's more, much more." For the next hour, she and the silent witnesses presented their evidence methodically, professionally, their preparation evident in every detail. Dr. Parker explained the falsified medical reports. Claire revealed the financial paper trail. Margaret presented testimony from other residents and families. Then Elizabeth opened Barbara's diary. "Before I read this," she said, her voice softening, "I want everyone to understand something. Barbara Reynolds was not just a victim of this system. She was a respected judge who spent her final years documenting exactly how these predators operate. This is her testimony." The room fell silent as Elizabeth read Barbara's detailed accounts of legal manipulation, of how vulnerable seniors were, systematically stripped of their rights, of the complex web of corruption that enabled the entire scheme. On the monitors, they could see Thomas's press conference dissolving into chaos as reporters confronted him with the mounting evidence. His lawyer tried to end the questioning, but the damage was done. "We are not confused," Elizabeth concluded, looking directly into the cameras. "We are not impaired. We are strong, capable women who refuse to be silenced. And we have a message for every predator who thinks they can exploit vulnerable seniors. Your time is over. We are watching, we are documenting, and we will not stop until every victim finds justice." As the room erupted in questions, Marcus watched his mother handle each one with grace and authority. The silent witnesses stood united behind her, their presence a testament to the power of truth over deception. Outside, the city hummed with the energy of breaking news. In newsrooms across the country, editors rushed to update their headlines. In care facilities everywhere, residents gathered around televisions, hope kindling in their eyes as they watched their story finally being told. The tide had turned. The silence was broken, and in a hotel room across town, Thomas Harrison watched. His carefully constructed empire crumble, undone by the very women he had tried to silence. The aftermath of the dual press conferences swept through the nation like a tidal wave. Within hours, state attorneys general in 7 states announced investigations into elder care facilities. Silent witnesses chapters began forming spontaneously across the country, as more seniors and their families recognized the patterns of exploitation in their own communities. Elizabeth sat in the newly established headquarters of the Silent Witnesses Foundation, reviewing reports from their expanding network. The old library on Maple Street had been transformed into a command center, its quiet dignity perfectly suited to their mission. "Another facility in Arizona has been exposed," Sarah reported, bringing in the morning's updates. "The residents there formed their own documentation team after watching our press conference. They've already gathered substantial evidence of financial abuse." Dr. Parker looked up from her computer, where she was analyzing a new batch of medical records. "The pattern is remarkably consistent. They target wealthy seniors, especially women with significant assets. The same medical diagnoses, the same legal maneuvers, even the same language in the guardianship papers." "Because they never expected us to compare notes," Margaret added, organizing files from different states. "They thought each case was isolated, that we couldn't communicate with each other." Claire rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this. Thomas's entire network is unraveling. 3 more facility administrators have come forward, offering to testify in exchange for immunity." They're afraid of being implicated in what they're calling the Silver Oaks Syndicate. Elizabeth absorbed the news with quiet satisfaction. The very system that had been used to silence them was now working in their favor. But her thoughts kept returning to the women still trapped in facilities across the country. "We need to move faster," she said, standing to address the room. "Every day we wait, more residents are at risk. Marcus, what's the status of the emergency legal team?" Her son looked up from where he was coordinating with attorneys via video conference. "We've assembled lawyers in 12 states, all working pro bono. They're filing emergency injunctions to freeze assets and suspend fraudulent guardianships. Richard's coordinating the overall strategy." Richard Bennett nodded from his corner of the room where he was reviewing case files. "The legal precedent we're establishing with the Silver Oaks case will help expedite other cases. Judges are starting to recognize the pattern." A young volunteer rushed in with breaking news. "The governor just announced a statewide audit of all elder care facilities. They're specifically looking for cases of forced labor and financial exploitation." The room buzzed with energy, but Elizabeth noticed something else, a subtle shift in how the volunteers and professionals interacted with the elderly residents who came to seek help. There was no condescension, no patronizing patience. Instead, there was respect, attention, and a growing understanding that age didn't diminish, wisdom or capability. "We've received another 100 calls since morning," Sarah updated, checking her tablet. "But these are different. People aren't just reporting abuse, they're offering to help. Former lawyers, doctors, accountants, all wanting to volunteer. Their expertise." Marcus watched his mother as she coordinated the expanding operation. She had transformed from a victim to a leader, but more than that, she had become a symbol of resilience and dignity. The women around her, once dismissed as confused or incapable, now commanded attention and respect. Patricia Whitmore's testimony just came in, Claire announced, bringing over a thick file. "She's naming names, dates, locations, everything about how the network operated." Elizabeth took the file but didn't open it immediately. "She's trying to save herself," she observed, "just like James did, but her testimony will help us save others, so we'll use it." Dr. Parker joined them, her medical expertise adding weight to her words. The psychological impact of what they did, it wasn't just about the money. They tried to make us doubt ourselves, our memories, our capabilities. That's the real damage we need to address. Then that's what the foundation will focus on, Elizabeth decided. Not just legal aid and investigation, but restoration of dignity. Every person who comes to us needs to know they're not just being rescued, they're being empowered. As if to emphasize her point, a group of former Silver Oaks residents arrived for their daily volunteer shift. These women, who had once been forced to work as unpaid servants, now chose to contribute their skills to help others. They moved through the headquarters with purpose and pride, their experiences making them uniquely qualified to spot signs of abuse and support new survivors. "We've started something remarkable," Margaret observed, watching the bustling activity. "It's not just about exposing corruption anymore. We're changing how society views aging and vulnerability." Elizabeth smiled, remembering the days when she had secretly documented everything in her small notebook at Silver Oaks. "We're showing them that wisdom doesn't diminish with age, and strength often comes disguised as vulnerability." A call came in from another state, another facility where residents had begun gathering evidence, another group of seniors refusing to be silenced, another wave in the growing movement for dignity and justice. "Send them everything they need," Elizabeth instructed. "Documents, guidelines, support. Remember how it felt to stand alone? No one should have to feel that way again." The day continued, filled with small victories and new challenges. But something fundamental had shifted in the world. The silence had been broken, and in its place a powerful new voice had emerged, the voice of experience, wisdom, and unshakable dignity. The transformation of the old Maple Street Library into the Silent Witnesses Foundation headquarters had been completed in record time, thanks to volunteers from across the community. The once quiet reading rooms now buzzed with purpose, each space dedicated to a different aspect of their expanding mission. In what had been the reference section, Sarah coordinated the nationwide network of Silent Witnesses chapters, her art dealer's eye for detail proving invaluable in organizing the flow of information. The rare books room had become a secure documentation center where Claire and her team processed evidence from new cases. The children's reading room, with its cheerful murals still intact, now served as a welcoming space for families seeking help. Elizabeth moved through these spaces with quiet authority, stopping to offer guidance, support, or simply a listening ear to the steady stream of visitors. The foundation had become more than just a response to injustice. It was a beacon of hope for anyone facing elder exploitation. "We've received confirmation from the State Medical Board," Dr. Parker announced during their morning briefing. "They're launching a formal investigation into every doctor who provided suspicious competency evaluations. 3 have already surrendered their licenses." Marcus, who had been reviewing financial reports, looked up with satisfaction. "The Banking Commission is following suit. They're implementing new protocols for monitoring suspicious Guardian-controlled accounts. They're calling it the Silent Witnesses Protocol." Elizabeth felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The very systems that had been used against them were being reformed from within, but her attention was drawn to a new arrival, an elderly woman, being gently escorted in by her granddaughter. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah greeted them, recognizing the name from their intake list. "Welcome to the Foundation." Mrs. Chen clutched her handbag tightly, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Elizabeth recognized the look. She had seen it in her own mirror during her days at Silver Oaks. The look of someone who had been convinced that their fears were merely paranoia. "It's all right," Elizabeth said softly, approaching them. "You're safe here. Would you like to tell us your story?" Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen's story emerged. A familiar pattern of manipulation by her son-in-law, gradual isolation from her resources, threats of institutionalization. But there was a new element. She had seen the silent witnesses on the news and recognized her own situation. "I knew I wasn't crazy," Mrs. Chen said, her voice growing stronger. "When I saw you all speaking out, I knew I had to be brave too." Her granddaughter squeezed her hand. "That's why we came directly here. Grandma said no lawyers, no police. She wanted to talk to the silent witnesses first." Elizabeth nodded in understanding. "Because we've lived it. We know exactly what you're going through." She turned to Claire. "Let's get Mrs. Chen's documentation started, and Sarah, can you connect them with the local Silent Witnesses chapter for support?" As the team mobilized to help their new clients, Marcus received an urgent call. The board of Silver Oaks was attempting one last desperate move. They were trying to sell the facility before the state investigation could freeze their assets. "They never learn," Margaret commented, overhearing the news. "They still think they can outmaneuver us." Elizabeth's expression hardened slightly. "They're used to dealing with isolated individuals. They don't know how to fight a united front." She turned to Richard. "How quickly can we get an emergency injunction?" "Already on it," the attorney replied, typing rapidly on his laptop. "Judge Collins is standing by. She's become quite a supporter of our cause." A young volunteer rushed in with more updates. Silent Witnesses chapters in 3 more states had successfully blocked similar attempted sales. The pattern of last-minute asset liquidation had become so predictable that they had developed standard procedures to prevent it. "We've come so far," Sarah mused, watching Mrs. Chen working with Claire to document her case. "Remember when we thought we were powerless?" Elizabeth smiled, remembering the days of secret note-taking and whispered conversations in Silver Oaks corridors. "We were never powerless. We just needed to find each other." The afternoon brought a surprise visitor. A former administrator from another facility, carrying boxes of documents. "I can't be part of this anymore," she explained, her voice shaking. "After seeing your press conference, after reading about Barbara Reynolds, I have to make this right." As Claire and her team began processing the new evidence, Elizabeth reflected on how their movement had grown. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about changing hearts and minds, about showing that age didn't diminish worth or wisdom. "Mom," Marcus called softly, approaching with a newspaper. "You should see this." The headline read, "Silent Witnesses Movement Sparks National Reform in Elder Care." The article detailed how their work had inspired changes in legislation, medical, oversight and financial regulations, but it was the accompanying photograph that caught Elizabeth's attention. A group of silent witnesses members standing tall and proud, their faces showing strength rather than vulnerability. "We're rewriting the narrative," Dr. Parker observed, reading over her shoulder. "Not just about elder abuse, but about aging itself, about what it means to be older in our society." Elizabeth watched as Mrs. Chen, already looking more confident, joined a group session with other survivors. The transformation was beginning, from victim to advocate, from silence to strength. "Every person who finds their voice here," Elizabeth said softly, "becomes a beacon for someone else. That's how we build real change. Not just through laws and regulations, but through showing others what's possible." The day continued, filled with small victories and new challenges. But in every corner of the building, in every conversation and connection, the same message resonated. No one was alone anymore. The silence had been broken, and in its place, a chorus of voices rose, strong, clear, and unafraid. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation on the morning of the hearing. Thomas Harrison and his remaining allies were about to face the consequences of their actions, and the gallery was packed with silent witnesses members from across the country. Elizabeth sat in the front row, flanked by Marcus and Sarah. Behind them, rows of survivors from various facilities waited to witness justice being served. Each face told a story of resilience, each presence a testament to the movement they had built. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Miranda Torres entered the courtroom. Known for her expertise in elder law, she had been specifically chosen to oversee this landmark case. Thomas and his remaining co-defendants stood at their table, their expensive suits no longer projecting the confidence they once had. James was conspicuously absent, having already accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against the larger network. "Before we begin," Judge Torres addressed the court, "I want to acknowledge the significance of this hearing. This isn't just about one facility or one group of defendants. This case represents a systematic failure to protect our most vulnerable citizens." Elizabeth watched as Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Gone was the man who had once commanded rooms with his presence. In his place stood someone smaller, diminished by the weight of his exposed crimes. The prosecution presented their case methodically, building on months of evidence gathered by the silent witnesses. Claire testified about the financial records she had preserved. Dr. Parker explained the pattern of falsified medical evaluations. Sarah described how wealthy residents were targeted and isolated from their families, but it was Barbara Reynolds's diary that delivered the most powerful testimony. Richard Bennett read excerpts, his voice carrying the weight of her final words. "They think we don't see them. They believe our age makes us blind to their manipulation. But we see everything. We remember everything. And someday, someone will give voice to our silence." Thomas's defense team attempted to paint their clients as well-meaning professionals who had simply followed established industry practices. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence, thousands of documents, recordings, and witness testimonies collected by women they had dismissed as confused and incompetent. During a brief recess, Marcus noticed his mother writing in a small notebook. "What are you working on?" he asked softly. "Ideas for the foundation," Elizabeth replied. "This hearing isn't the end, it's just the beginning. We need to be ready to help others who will come forward after this." Sarah joined them, tablet in hand. "We've received messages from silent witnesses chapters in 30 states. They're all watching the live stream of the proceedings. This case is giving others the courage to speak up." Back in session, the prosecution called their final witness, Patricia Whitmore. The former Silver Oaks administrator had agreed to testify about the full scope of the operation. As she detailed years of systematic exploitation, Thomas's facade finally cracked. "We never meant to," he began, rising from his seat. "Silence," Judge Torres commanded. "You've had years to speak your piece, Mr. Harrison. Now it's time to listen." Whitmore's testimony painted a damning picture of calculated predation. She described how they selected their targets, how they manipulated medical records, how they forced residents into unpaid labor while draining their accounts. It was perfect, she admitted, her voice heavy with shame. Who would believe them over us? We had the papers, the diagnoses, the legal authority. We thought we were untouchable. Elizabeth listened calmly, her hand steady as she continued making notes. The woman's testimony wasn't revealing anything they didn't already know. The silent witnesses had documented it all. But hearing it acknowledged in open court, seeing the justice system finally recognize their truth, felt like a victory long overdue. During closing arguments, the prosecution pointed to the broader implications of the case. This isn't just about punishing individual wrongdoing, the prosecutor declared. This is about recognizing and correcting a systemic failure to protect our elders. The silent witnesses have shown us that age does not diminish a person's right to dignity, autonomy, and justice. Judge Torres listened intently, her expression grave as she considered the mountain of evidence before her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of historical significance. This court has seen countless cases of exploitation and abuse, she began, but what makes this case extraordinary is not just the scope of the crimes, but the courage of those who exposed them. The silent witnesses have done more than prove their case. They have exposed a national crisis of elder exploitation. She turned her attention to the defendants. You preyed upon those you thought couldn't fight back. You weaponized age and vulnerability against your victims. You twisted the very systems meant to protect them into tools of exploitation. Elizabeth sat straighter as the judge continued, feeling the collective tension in the room. But your greatest mistake, Judge Torres concluded, was underestimating the strength, wisdom, and resilience of the very people you targeted. The silent witnesses have demonstrated that age does not diminish capability, that wisdom often speaks softly, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, cannot be denied. As the judge prepared to announce her ruling, Elizabeth felt Marcus squeeze her hand. Around them, survivors and advocates held their breath, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be served. The silence in the courtroom was no longer one of suppression, but of anticipation, the quiet before a victory long in the making. Judge Torres's ruling fell like thunder in the hushed courtroom. The sentences were severe, significant prison terms for Thomas and his co-defendants, massive financial penalties, and permanent bans from any involvement in healthcare or elder care services. But it was her accompanying statement that truly marked the historical significance of the moment. This court hereby establishes the Reynolds Protocol, she declared, naming it after Barbara, requiring all elder care facilities to implement comprehensive oversight measures. Never again will we allow the systems meant to protect our seniors to become instruments of exploitation. As the defendants were led away, Elizabeth remained seated, her expression serene. Thomas glanced at her as he passed, one final look at the woman he had tried to silence, now instrumental in his downfall. She met his gaze steadily, neither triumphant nor bitter, simply present in the moment of justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around the silent witnesses' leaders. Sarah handled the media with practiced grace, while Marcus coordinated with their legal team about the implications of the ruling. But all eyes were on Elizabeth as she stepped to the microphones. Today's verdict is not an ending, she began, her voice clear and strong. It's a beginning. The Silent Witnesses Foundation will continue our work, not just in exposing abuse, but in rebuilding the systems that should protect our elderly citizens. Dr. Parker stepped forward to outline their next initiatives. We're establishing advocacy, centers in every state, staffed by professionals and survivors working together. The Reynolds Protocol will ensure that no facility can ever again operate without proper oversight. Back at Foundation headquarters, the celebration was tempered by purpose. New cases arrived daily, each one finding not just help, but empowerment. The library's former reading rooms had become training centers, where survivors learned to become advocates for others. We've received calls from 3 more states, Claire reported, managing their expanding network. They want to establish Silent Witnesses chapters. The movement is growing faster than we anticipated. Margaret, organizing their next training session, smiled. Remember when we thought we were alone? Now look at us. We're building an army of advocates." Elizabeth moved through the busy rooms, watching survivors transform into leaders. Mrs. Chen, who had arrived so recently seeking help, was now helping other Chinese-speaking seniors document their cases. Former residents of Silver Oaks trained new volunteers in spotting signs of exploitation. Marcus found his mother in Barbara's former office, now a memorial space dedicated to those who hadn't lived to see this day. "The board meeting went well," he reported. "Anderson Global Ventures is fully committed to funding the foundation's expansion." "It's not about the money anymore," Elizabeth replied, touching Barbara's diary preserved under glass. "It's about changing how society views aging and vulnerability, about turning silence into strength." Sarah entered with fresh statistics. "The Reynolds Protocol is already having an impact. 3 major care facility networks have voluntarily adopted the oversight measures. They're calling it preemptive compliance. They see which way the wind is blowing," Dr. Parker observed. "Change is coming whether they're ready or not." As evening fell, Elizabeth stood at the window of their headquarters, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold. The same city where not so long ago she had knelt scrubbing floors, believing herself powerless. Now it was home to a movement that was changing lives across the nation. A group of new arrivals caught her attention, elderly residents from another facility, coming to share their stories. They entered the building hesitantly but were immediately welcomed by other survivors. Elizabeth watched as fear gave way to recognition. Isolation transformed into community. "That's what we really won today," she said to Marcus, who had joined her at the window. "Not just justice in one courtroom, but hope for every person who's ever felt silenced." The foundation hummed with activity around them. Claire coordinated with law enforcement about new cases. Sarah planned their next public awareness campaign. Dr. Parker trained medical professionals in recognizing signs of exploitation, each person contributing their strength to the larger mission. "You know what Barbara wrote in her final diary entry?" Elizabeth asked softly. She said, "They thought they could break us by keeping us apart, but they forgot. Wisdom knows how to whisper, and whispers know how to find each other." Marcus watched as more people arrived, seeking help or offering support. The silent witnesses had become more than just a response to injustice. They were a testament to the power of united voices, the strength of shared purpose. "The Reynolds Protocol will protect others," Elizabeth continued. "But our real legacy is showing that age doesn't diminish worth, that vulnerability can become strength, that silence can transform into powerful advocacy." As night fell over the city, lights burned bright in the foundation's windows. Inside, survivors became leaders, whispers became voices, and silence transformed into symphony. The day's victory in court was significant, but the real triumph was in every person who found their voice, every story that found its audience, every whisper that joined the growing chorus of change. 6 months after the landmark court ruling, the Silent Witnesses Foundation had grown beyond anything Elizabeth could have imagined. The old library building, once their sole headquarters, was now the central hub of a nationwide network of advocacy centers. Each center carried forward their mission of protection, empowerment, and transformation. On this particular morning, Elizabeth stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Elder Rights. The audience included lawmakers, healthcare professionals, and advocates from across the country. But most importantly, it included survivors, hundreds of them, each with their own story of resistance and recovery. "When I first began documenting the abuses at Silver Oaks," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I thought I was alone. We all did. That was their greatest weapon against us, isolation. But today I look out at this room and see the power of united voices." Sarah, now the Foundation's Director of Advocacy, managed the presentation as Elizabeth shared their latest initiatives. The Reynolds Protocol had been adopted by 28 states, with legislation pending in 15 more. But their work had evolved beyond just exposing abuse. "The Silent Witnesses Institute opens next month," Elizabeth announced, displaying images of a modern building rising on the outskirts of the city. "It will serve as both a training center for advocates and a research facility dedicated to elder rights and protection. Dr. Parker, who would head the Institute's medical research division, stepped forward to explain their innovative approach. We're not just studying abuse prevention, we're revolutionizing how society views aging. Our programs combine the wisdom of survivors with the expertise of professionals. The presentation was interrupted by unexpected applause when Mrs. Chen took the stage. 6 months ago, she had entered their offices as a frightened victim. Now, she stood tall as the director of their multicultural outreach program. Exploitation knows no cultural boundaries, Mrs. Chen declared, her confidence a testament to their mission. But neither does courage. Our multilingual advocacy programs now serve communities in 12 languages. Marcus watched from the wings, marveling at the transformation. The Foundation's work had expanded far beyond their initial goals. They weren't just helping individuals anymore. They were changing the very culture that had enabled exploitation. Claire, who had recently been promoted to Chief Compliance Officer, presented their latest technology initiative. The Silent Witnesses Alert Network allows advocates to identify patterns of abuse before they escalate. We're preventing exploitation, not just responding to it. During the break, Elizabeth met with a group of state legislators who were championing the Reynolds Protocol in their jurisdictions. The conversation shifted from law enforcement to cultural change, from punishment to prevention. The real challenge, Elizabeth explained, isn't just changing laws, it's changing minds. We need to build a society that values and protects its elders, that sees age as an asset rather than a vulnerability. Sarah brought over their latest statistics. The Foundation's work had directly helped over 10,000 seniors in the past 6 months, but the indirect impact was even more significant. Their advocacy had sparked a national conversation about aging, dignity, and empowerment. We've received inquiries from 12 countries, Sarah reported. They want to implement similar programs. The Silent Witnesses model is becoming an international standard for elder protection. In the afternoon session, survivors shared their stories. Each testimony added to their collective wisdom. Each voice strengthened their united purpose. Elizabeth noticed how the audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. These weren't just sad tales of exploitation. They were powerful narratives of resilience and transformation. Margaret, who had expanded their documentation training program to multiple cities, presented their latest findings. We're seeing a significant decrease in reported abuse cases in areas where the Reynolds Protocol has been implemented. But more importantly, we're seeing an increase in early intervention. People are speaking up sooner, and communities are responding faster. The day's final presentation focused on their newest initiative, the Silent Witnesses Legacy Project. Elizabeth returned to the podium to introduce it. Barbara Reynolds left us more than just evidence of wrongdoing, she said, touching the locket she always wore, a gift from Barbara before her passing. She left us a blueprint for change. The Legacy Project will ensure that every survivor's story contributes to our collective wisdom, that every voice adds to our strength. As the conference continued, Elizabeth took a moment to observe the bustling activity around her. In every corner, survivors and advocates worked together, sharing experiences and strategies. The fear and isolation that had once defined their experiences had been transformed into confidence and community. A young social worker approached Elizabeth with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother was in a facility like Silver Oaks," she said. "We lost her before we could help her. But because of your work, I'm now helping others." Her story didn't end with her. It lives on in every person we save. Elizabeth embraced the young woman, understanding the weight of her words. They had created more than just an organization. They had built a movement that would outlive them all. Every story shared, every life touched, every voice empowered added to their collective strength. As the day drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself back on stage, looking out at the sea of faces. These weren't just audience members. They were partners in a revolution of dignity and justice. The silence had been broken, and in its place, a powerful chorus of voices rose, each one carrying the message forward. Never again would age be used as a weapon against the wise. The opening of the Silent Witnesses Institute marked a new chapter in their journey. The modern facility, built on the outskirts of the city, stood as a testament to their evolution from a grassroots movement to a powerful force for change. Its glass walls and open spaces were designed to symbolize transparency and accessibility, while the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Garden provided a peaceful space for reflection and healing. Elizabeth walked through the Institute's halls, taking in the atmosphere of purposeful activity. In the training center, Dr. Parker was conducting a session for healthcare professionals, teaching them to recognize subtle signs of exploitation. In another room, Sarah led a workshop on advocacy techniques, sharing the wisdom they'd gained from countless cases. "The latest numbers are in," Claire reported, falling into step beside Elizabeth. "The Reynolds Protocol has led to a 60% reduction in reported cases of elder exploitation in participating states. But more importantly, we're seeing a cultural shift in how facilities treat their residents." They passed the technology hub, where Mrs. Chen was demonstrating their multilingual reporting system to a group of international observers. The Silent Witnesses Alert Network now operated in multiple countries, creating a global safety net for vulnerable seniors. "It's amazing," Marcus commented, joining them. "Remember when we thought we were just fighting one case? Now we're changing how the world thinks about aging and vulnerability." Elizabeth smiled, remembering those early days at Silver Oaks. "We had to start somewhere. Every movement begins with a single voice." They entered the research center, where Margaret was coordinating with universities studying the long-term impact of their work. The walls displayed maps showing the spread of their influence, dots of light representing each Silent Witnesses chapter, each advocacy center, each life touched by their mission. "We've received an interesting proposal," Sarah announced, catching up with them. "The National Council on Aging wants to incorporate our training programs into their standard curriculum. They're calling it the Silent Witnesses approach to elder advocacy." The afternoon brought a special ceremony in the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Garden. Survivors from across the country gathered to dedicate a new installation, A Wall of Wisdom, featuring quotes and stories from those who had transformed their pain into purpose. "Barbara would have loved this," Elizabeth said softly, touching the engraved words of her friend. "She always said our stories were our strongest weapon against injustice." The ceremony was interrupted by exciting news from Claire. "The Supreme Court just announced they'll hear our case on nationwide implementation of the Reynolds Protocol. They're fast-tracking it due to its significance in elder protection law." The announcement sent a buzz through the gathered crowd. What had begun as one woman's fight for dignity had grown into a landmark legal battle that could reshape elder care across the nation. As the day progressed, Elizabeth found herself in the Institute's central atrium, where a group of new advocates was being trained. These weren't just professionals. They were survivors, family members, and community leaders, each committed to carrying the mission forward. Mrs. Chen, now confident and commanding, led a session on cultural competency in elder advocacy. "Respect for elders is universal," she explained, "but so is the potential for exploitation. We must build bridges across all communities." In the Technology Center, Claire showcased their latest innovation, an artificial intelligence system designed to detect patterns of financial exploitation before they escalated into full-blown fraud. "We're not just responding to abuse anymore," she explained. "We're preventing it." Marcus, who had restructured his entire company to support their mission, presented their economic impact study. The Silent Witnesses approach wasn't just protecting seniors. It was saving billions in prevented fraud and improved healthcare outcomes. As evening approached, Elizabeth gathered with her core team in the garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the memorial wall, where Barbara's words glowed in golden light. "Wisdom whispers, but truth echoes through generations." "We've come so far," Sarah reflected, "but there's still so much to do." Elizabeth nodded, watching new visitors explore the Institute. "That's the beauty of what we've built. It's not dependent on any one of us anymore. The mission will continue, grow, evolve." Dr. Parker joined them, bringing updates from their international partners. "The European Union is adopting our protocols. Asia is developing culturally adapted versions of our programs. The silence is being broken everywhere. As night fell, the Institute's lights created a warm glow against the darkening sky. Inside, work continued. Advocates training, researchers analyzing, survivors healing and growing stronger. The building hummed with purpose, each room a testament to their journey from victims to champions. Elizabeth stood at the window of her office, overlooking the city where their movement had begun. Somewhere out there, Thomas sat in his cell, his empire of exploitation dismantled. But their victory had grown into something far greater than justice against one man or one facility. They had created a legacy of empowerment, a network of protection that would outlast them all. The silent witnesses had become a chorus of wisdom, their collective voice echoing through institutions, communities, and generations. "We're not just changing laws," Elizabeth had told the morning's audience. "We're changing hearts. We're showing the world that age brings wisdom, that vulnerability can become strength, that silence can transform into symphony." As she prepared to leave for the day, a new group of survivors arrived for evening counseling. Elizabeth watched them enter, hesitant at first, then straightening as they felt the warmth of welcome, the strength of community. In their faces, she saw reflections of her own journey, and in their growing confidence, she saw the future of their movement. The Silent Witnesses Institute stood as more than just a building. It was a beacon of hope, a center of transformation, a testament to the power of united voices. And in its halls, the whispers of wisdom continued to grow into shouts of triumph, ensuring that never again would age be mistaken for weakness, or silence be mistaken for submission. 1 year to the day after the Supreme Court ruling that made the Reynolds Protocol national law, Elizabeth stood in her old room at Silver Oaks. The facility had been transformed, not just physically but fundamentally. Where once silence and fear had reigned, now warmth and dignity flourished. "It's strange being back here," she said to Marcus, who stood beside her. The small room where she had once hidden her documented evidence was now part of the Silent Witnesses Training Center, teaching new advocates how to recognize and prevent elder exploitation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. The last group of residents from the old administration has been relocated to certified facilities. Silver Oaks is officially ready for its new chapter. The transformation of Silver Oaks into the flagship campus of the Silent Witnesses Foundation was more than symbolic. It represented everything they had fought for, turning a place of exploitation into a center of empowerment. "Mrs. Anderson?" a young nurse approached respectfully. "The new residents are arriving. They'd like to meet the woman who made all this possible." Elizabeth smiled, remembering her first day at Silver Oaks, when she had been stripped of her dignity and identity. Now, new residents arrived not as prisoners, but as valued community members. In the main lobby, Dr. Parker was conducting orientation for the incoming medical staff. "The Reynolds Protocol isn't just about preventing abuse," she explained. "It's about creating an environment where seniors thrive, where their wisdom is valued, where their voices matter." Mrs. Chen, who had become one of their most effective advocates, led a group of family members on a tour. "See these security features," she explained. "They're not to keep residents in, but to keep exploitation out. Every financial transaction is monitored, every medical decision documented transparently." Claire, overseeing the installation of their latest monitoring systems, waved Elizabeth over. "We've integrated the alert network throughout the facility. Any pattern of suspicious behavior triggers immediate review. The safeguards we wished for back then, they're reality now." The facility's transformation went beyond safety measures. The old cleaning closets where Elizabeth had been forced to work had been converted into art studios. The sterile corridors now displayed residents' artwork and photographs. Every space was designed to celebrate life, wisdom, and dignity. Margaret approached with their latest impact report. "You should see this, Elizabeth. The data from our first year of nationwide implementation is remarkable. Elder exploitation cases have dropped by 70% in monitored facilities, but more importantly, resident satisfaction and engagement have soared." As they walked the grounds, Elizabeth noticed small groups of residents and staff members in animated discussion. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined such facilities had been replaced by genuine community. "Remember when we thought we were just fighting?" "For justice?" Marcus asked, watching a resident teach a staff member to play chess. "We ended up creating something much bigger." Elizabeth nodded, pausing to admire the garden she had once tended under very different circumstances. "We created a model for change, not just in elder care, but in how society values its wisest members." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A group of international delegates had arrived to study the Silent Witnesses model. The Foundation's approach to elder protection was being adopted worldwide, with Silver Oaks serving as the premier example of transformation. "Mrs. Anderson," one of the delegates called out, recognizing her. "Your story inspired similar movements. In our country, we've come to learn how you turned tragedy into triumph." Elizabeth led them to the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Library, where the full history of their movement was preserved. "It began with whispers," she explained, showing them the original documents they had secretly gathered. Individual voices, too quiet to be heard alone, but powerful when united. The delegates listened intently as she described their journey, from isolated victims to organized advocates, from silent witnesses to powerful agents of change. Each element of their story contributed to a larger lesson about the strength of united purpose. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth found herself back in the garden, now a vibrant space where residents grew flowers and vegetables together. A small group had gathered for their daily meditation session, their peaceful presence a stark contrast to the fear that had once permeated these grounds. "You know what makes this truly special," Sarah said, joining her. "It's not just that. We stopped exploitation. It's that we created a new vision of what elder care could be, should be." Elizabeth watched as a new resident was warmly welcomed by others, immediately drawn into their community. The woman's hesitant expression transformed into a smile as she realized this was not the institution she had feared. "We didn't just change a system," Elizabeth reflected. "We changed expectations. We showed that age deserves not just protection, but a celebration." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the renewed grounds of Silver Oaks, Elizabeth felt the weight of their journey. The place that had once represented her lowest point now stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience and unified purpose. A young advocate approached with questions about their early days. "How did you find the courage to keep fighting?" she asked. Elizabeth smiled, touching Barbara's locket. "We discovered that courage grows stronger when shared. That wisdom, when united with purpose, becomes unstoppable. Most importantly, we learned that every voice, no matter how silenced, carries the power to spark revolution." The evening sun cast a golden glow through the windows of the Silent Witnesses Foundation's main conference room. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the core team that had grown from a small group of survivors into a powerful force for change. They had gathered to celebrate not just their achievements, but the continuing evolution of their mission. The Supreme Court's decision to universally implement the Reynolds Protocol was just the beginning, Sarah reported, displaying their latest statistics. "We're seeing a complete paradigm shift in how society views and values its elderly members." Dr. Parker nodded in agreement. "Medical schools are now incorporating our training programs into their core curriculum. The next generation of healthcare providers will understand that age brings wisdom, not weakness." Claire, who had developed their worldwide monitoring system, shared updates from their global partners. The Silent Witnesses model has been adapted in 37 countries. Each culture brings its own wisdom to the approach, strengthening our collective understanding. Elizabeth listened with quiet satisfaction as each team member reported their progress. Mrs. Chen's multicultural outreach had bridged communities. Margaret's advocacy training had empowered thousands. Every success built upon the foundation they had created together. "But our most significant impact," Marcus added, "isn't in the statistics or the legal victories. It's in the stories of lives transformed." As if to emphasize his point, a group of residents from the renewed Silver Oaks facility joined their meeting. These weren't the fearful, silenced individuals of the past. They were active participants in their community, their voices strong and clear. One elderly gentleman, a former judge, spoke up. "Before finding the silent witnesses, I had lost everything, my home, my dignity, my voice. Now I help others reclaim their rights. We're not just survivors anymore, we're champions of change." Elizabeth watched as more people filled the room, advocates, survivors, professionals, all part of their extended family. The movement they had built had transcended its origins, becoming a symphony of united voices rising against injustice. "Remember when we thought we were alone?" Sarah whispered to Elizabeth. "Now look at us. We're an army of wisdom." The discussion turned to their future initiatives. The Silent Witnesses Institute was expanding its research into preventive measures. New technology was being developed to protect vulnerable seniors. Educational programs were reaching into communities previously untouched by their message. "But our greatest achievement," Elizabeth said, rising to address the room, "is that we've changed the narrative. Age is no longer seen as a weakness to be exploited, but as a strength to be celebrated." As she spoke, Elizabeth thought of Barbara Reynolds, whose courage had helped spark their revolution. She touched the locket containing Barbara's picture, drawing strength from her friend's memory. "We've built something remarkable," she continued. "Not just an organization, but a movement that will continue growing long after we're gone. Every person who finds their voice, every story that breaks the silence adds to our collective strength." The room hummed with energy as plans were made, ideas shared, and new initiatives launched. The Silent Witnesses Foundation had become more than a response to injustice. It was a force for transformative change, a beacon of hope for vulnerable seniors worldwide. Marcus watched his mother with pride. The woman who had once been forced to clean floors in silence now commanded international respect, her wisdom helping to reshape society's treatment of its elderly members. "You know what makes our success sustainable?" Elizabeth asked the gathered crowd. "It's not just our protocols or programs, it's the understanding that every voice matters, that wisdom grows stronger when shared, that age brings not decline, but deepening insight." As the meeting drew to a close, Elizabeth stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The city spread out before her, each light representing a life touched by their movement, a voice added to their chorus. "We didn't just break the silence," she reflected. "We created a new kind of conversation, one where age is honored, wisdom is valued, and every voice contributes to our collective strength." The room gradually emptied, but the energy of their gathering lingered. In offices across the globe, advocates continued their work. In facilities everywhere, seniors lived with dignity and purpose. The whispers that had once been silenced had grown into a powerful chorus of change. Elizabeth smiled, thinking of how far they had come from those dark days at Silver Oaks. Their journey had transformed not just their own lives, but the very fabric of society's approach to aging and vulnerability. "The silence is broken," she said softly, "and in its place we've built something beautiful, a legacy of strength, wisdom, and united purpose that will echo through generations to come." As night fell over the city, the lights of the Silent Witnesses Foundation burned bright, a beacon of hope and transformation. Inside, the work continued, each person contributing to their shared mission of protecting, empowering, and celebrating the wisdom that comes with age. The story of the Silent Witnesses had become more than a tale of justice served. It was a testament to the power of united voices, the strength of shared purpose, and the enduring truth that wisdom, when given voice, has the power to change the world. 18 months after the transformation of Silver Oaks, Elizabeth found herself addressing a unique gathering in the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Garden. Representatives from 50 countries had come to witness the inauguration of the International Council for Elder Dignity, a global extension of the Silent Witnesses movement. "When we first began documenting abuses at Silver Oaks," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we could never have imagined standing here today. But wisdom, like a seed, only needs the right conditions to grow." The garden, once her place of forced labor, had become a living symbol of their transformation. Residents now tended it voluntarily, growing not just flowers but hope for future generations. Each plant represented a story of survival, each bloom a testament to resilience. Sarah, now coordinating their international expansion, presented the latest milestone. The Silent Witnesses model has been adapted and implemented in over 200 cities worldwide, but more importantly, we're seeing cultural shifts in how societies view and value their elderly members. Dr. Parker's research team had documented these changes scientifically. Communities that adopt the Reynolds Protocol show measurable improvements not just in elder safety, but in intergenerational relationships. We're healing the gap between generations. Marcus, who had restructured his entire business empire to support their mission, shared the economic impact. When we protect and empower our elderly population, everyone benefits. The wisdom they contribute to society far outweighs any cost of their protection. Mrs. Chen, leading a delegation from Asia, described how their approach had been adapted to different cultural contexts. The Silent Witnesses principles transcend cultural boundaries because they speak to universal human dignity. In the midst of the celebration, Claire brought breaking news. Thomas has requested a meeting, she announced quietly to Elizabeth. He's been participating in rehabilitation programs in prison, working with elderly inmates. He says he wants to make amends. Elizabeth absorbed this information thoughtfully. Their movement had always been about transformation, not just punishment. Arrange it, she decided. Perhaps his experience can help us understand how to prevent others from following his path. The day continued with presentations from various international chapters. Our group from South America described their rural outreach programs. European delegates shared innovations in technology-assisted monitoring. African representatives discussed incorporating traditional wisdom-keeping roles into modern elder protection. Margaret, who had been quietly observing, pointed out something remarkable. "Look at our audience," she whispered to Elizabeth. "Young and old, from every background, all united in purpose. We've created more than just a protection system. We've sparked a cultural revolution." The afternoon session focused on their newest initiative, the Intergenerational Wisdom Project. Young professionals were paired with elderly mentors, creating bridges of understanding and respect across age gaps. "This is how we ensure lasting change," Elizabeth explained to the gathered delegates, by showing younger generations that age brings not decline but deepening insight, that our elders are not burdens to be managed, but treasures to be cherished. A surprise presentation came from a group of former Silver Oaks residents who had created a documentary about their journey from victims to advocates. Their stories, told in their own voices, brought tears and inspiration to the audience. As evening approached, Elizabeth toured the expanded facility with international visitors. Every corner of the former Silver Oaks now served their mission of protection and empowerment. The cleaning closets where she had once hidden her documentation were now secure communication centers. The halls where she had scrubbed floors now hosted educational programs. "The most powerful weapon against exploitation," she told her guests, "is the transformation of silence into strength. When we unite our voices, wisdom becomes unstoppable." In the Technology Center, Claire demonstrated their latest innovations. The Silent Witnesses Alert Network had evolved into a sophisticated global system, connecting advocates and protecting vulnerable seniors across continents. "But technology is just a tool," Claire explained. "The real power lies in the human connections we build, the communities we create, the dignity we restore." As the day drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself back in the garden, watching the sunset with Sarah and Marcus. The international delegates had departed, carrying seeds of change back to their own communities. "You know what amazes me most?" Sarah reflected. "How our story keeps growing, evolving, touching more lives. It's like ripples in a pond, spreading further than we could have imagined." Elizabeth touched Barbara's locket, feeling the weight of their journey. "Because we did more than expose injustice," she said softly. "We created a new vision of what's possible when wisdom finds its voice." The garden glowed in the evening light, each flower a reminder of their transformation. Where fear had once grown, Hope now bloomed. Where silence had ruled, voices now rose in strength and unity. The meeting with Thomas was set for a quiet morning in the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Library. Elizabeth had chosen this location deliberately, surrounded by the documented history of their movement. The truth of their journey would be undeniable. Thomas looked smaller somehow, his prison uniform a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd once worn. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by something Elizabeth hadn't expected to see: genuine remorse. "I've been following the news," he began hesitantly. "What you've built, it's remarkable. The Silent Witnesses Foundation has become everything I fought against: transparency, dignity, empowerment." Elizabeth studied him carefully. "Why did you request this meeting, Thomas?" "I've been working with elderly inmates," he explained. "Men who've lost everything, their freedom, their dignity, their connection to family. It's helped me understand what I did to you, to all those residents at Silver Oaks." Marcus, who had insisted on being present, watched the interaction with mixed emotions. The man who had nearly destroyed his mother's life now sat before them, humbled by the very values he had once exploited. "I can't undo what I did," Thomas continued, "but I've documented everything, every contact, every scheme, every person involved in similar operations. It might help prevent others from following my path." Elizabeth accepted the thick folder he offered, passing it to Claire for proper processing. "Redemption isn't found in a single gesture, Thomas. It's built through consistent actions, through genuine change." "I know," he nodded. "That's why I've started a program in the prison, helping elderly inmates maintain their dignity, teaching younger inmates to respect and learn from their wisdom." "It's small compared to what you've built, but it's a start," Elizabeth finished. The irony wasn't lost on her. Their movement had touched even the man who had tried to silence them. Later that day, Elizabeth shared the experience with the Silent Witnesses leadership team. "Thomas's transformation shows us something important," she reflected. "Our work isn't just about protecting victims. It's about changing the mindset that creates exploitation." Sarah, reviewing Thomas's documentation, saw its potential. "This could help us identify vulnerable points in the system, strengthen our preventive measures." The afternoon brought a different kind of meeting, the first gathering of the Intergenerational Wisdom Council. Young professionals sat with elderly mentors, creating bridges across the age gap that had once enabled exploitation. Mrs. Chen facilitated a session where residents shared their life experiences with young business students. "Understanding comes from connection," she explained. "When we see the wisdom in age, exploitation becomes unthinkable." In the Technology Center, Claire worked with a team of young programmers, all of them mentored by former victims of financial exploitation. Together, they were developing new safeguards, their different perspectives strengthening the solutions they created. "This is how lasting change happens," Dr. Parker observed. "When those who could be victims become protectors, when those who might be exploiters become advocates." The day's final event was a ceremony in the garden, the planting of a new section dedicated to reconciliation and transformation. Elizabeth watched as former residents worked alongside community volunteers, creating beauty from what had once been a place of pain. "You know what's truly revolutionary about our movement," Margaret mused, joining her by the fountain. "We've shown that it's never too late for transformation, whether you're a victim finding your voice or an exploiter recognizing their wrongs." As evening fell, Elizabeth gathered with her core team in the library. The space had become more than just an archive of their struggle. It was a living testament to the power of united wisdom. "Thomas's story reminds us of something crucial," she told them. "Our work isn't about creating villains and victims. It's about transforming silence into strength, fear into wisdom, isolation into community." Marcus, watching his mother's peaceful expression, realized something profound. They had achieved more than justice. They had created healing. The Silent Witnesses Foundation had become not just a shield against exploitation, but a bridge to understanding. The lights of Silver Oaks glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, each window representing a story of transformation. Inside, residents and staff worked together, their relationships built on respect rather than power. The silence that had once hidden exploitation had been replaced by open dialogue, shared wisdom, and growing understanding. Elizabeth touched Barbara's locket one last time before heading home. "We did it, old friend," she whispered. "We turned our pain into purpose, our silence into strength, and the world is finally listening to the wisdom we always knew we had." 2 years to the day since she had first found her mother cleaning floors at Silver Oaks, Marcus stood in the grand auditorium of the Silent Witnesses Institute, watching Elizabeth receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The nation's highest civilian honor seemed a fitting recognition for a movement that had transformed society's approach to elder care and dignity. "This medal," Elizabeth said, addressing the packed audience, "belongs not just to me but to every person who refused to be silenced, to Barbara Reynolds, whose courage lit our path, to every resident who documented abuse, every advocate who stood with us, every voice that joined our chorus." The ceremony had brought together faces both familiar and new. Sarah, elegant in her role as international director, sat beside Mrs. Chen, whose multicultural outreach programs had become a model for global implementation. Dr. Parker and Claire represented the medical and technological innovations that had revolutionized elder protection. "When I think back to those days at Silver Oaks," Elizabeth continued, her voice strong and clear, "I remember the silence that weighed so heavily on all of us. But within that silence, we were gathering strength. Like seeds waiting for spring, we were preparing for transformation." The president's words during the presentation had captured the magnitude of their achievement. The Silent Witnesses Foundation has done more than protect vulnerable seniors. It has fundamentally changed how we view and value the wisdom that comes with age. After the ceremony, Elizabeth insisted on returning to the Foundation's headquarters. There was work to be done, and their mission continued regardless of accolades. In the main conference room, she found Margaret coordinating with their newest international chapters. "Tokyo just launched their first advocacy center," Margaret reported excitedly, "and Mumbai's pilot program is showing remarkable results. The Silent Witnesses model is adapting beautifully to different cultural contexts." Sarah brought in their latest impact report. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of seniors protected, hundreds of exploitative schemes exposed, dozens of countries implementing their protocols. But the real impact was in the stories, the individual lives transformed by their work. "Remember when we thought we were just fighting for justice?" Claire mused, reviewing the data. "We ended up creating a global revolution in elder care and dignity." Elizabeth smiled, touching Barbara's locket. "Because we understood something fundamental, that every voice matters, that wisdom grows stronger when shared, that age brings not weakness, but deepening insight." The afternoon brought a special session of their Intergenerational Wisdom Council. Young professionals sat with elderly mentors, learning not just from their experience, but from their resilience. The very dynamic that had once enabled exploitation was being transformed into a force for protection and understanding. Dr. Parker shared the latest research results. "We're seeing measurable changes in societal attitudes toward aging. Communities that implement our programs show significant improvements in intergenerational relationships and elder well-being." Mrs. Chen, who had just returned from an international conference, added her perspective. "What amazes me is how universal our message has become. Whether in Beijing or Boston, people recognize the value of protecting and empowering their elderly citizens." As evening approached, Elizabeth took a moment to walk through the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Garden. The space had become a symbol of their transformation, from a place of forced labor to a sanctuary of healing and growth. Each flower, each path, each bench told a story of renewal. Marcus found her there, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You know what strikes me most about today?" he said softly. "It's not the medal or the recognition. It's how many lives have been touched by what began as one person's stand against injustice." Elizabeth nodded, her hand resting on a bench dedicated to Barbara. "Because we did more than expose wrongdoing. We created a new vision of what's possible when wisdom is valued, when voices unite, when age is seen as an asset rather than a vulnerability." The garden had filled with people, residents, staff, advocates, and visitors, all gathering for their evening community program. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined such spaces had been replaced by genuine connection and mutual respect. "Look at them," Elizabeth said softly. "Every person here has a story, a voice, a contribution to make. That's what the Silent Witnesses Foundation really is. Not just a protection system, but a celebration of the wisdom that comes with years lived fully." The last rays of sunlight caught the presidential medal, making it gleam. But Elizabeth's true pride wasn't in the award. It was in the community they had built, the lives they had touched, the change they had created. "Our work continues," she reminded her son. "Every day brings new challenges, new opportunities to protect and empower. But now we face them together, our voices united, our wisdom shared, our strength multiplied by every person who joins our cause." As darkness fell, the garden's lights came on, creating a warm glow that seemed to embrace everyone present. The silence that had once hidden pain had been transformed into a symphony of voices, each one contributing to their collective strength. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Silent Witnesses Foundation's main hall, where Elizabeth stood before a gathering of new advocates. These weekly orientation sessions had become a cornerstone of their mission, ensuring that their message and methods would continue to grow and evolve. "Each of you," she began, looking at the diverse faces before her, "carries the potential to transform silence into strength. Our story began with whispers of resistance, but it continues through voices of empowerment." The hall was filled with people from all walks of life: young professionals, retired executives, former victims turned advocates, and family members touched by their mission. Each brought their own perspective to the growing movement. Sarah, now a respected international figure in elder rights, presented their expanded mission. "The Silent Witnesses Foundation isn't just about protection anymore. We're creating a new paradigm of aging, one where wisdom is celebrated, where experience is valued, where age brings not isolation, but deeper connection." Dr. Parker shared the latest developments in their preventive programs. "We're seeing a cultural shift in how society views its elderly members. The Reynolds Protocol has become more than just a set of guidelines. It's a framework for intergenerational understanding." Mrs. Chen, whose multicultural initiatives had bridged communities worldwide, spoke about their global impact. "From small villages to major cities, people are recognizing that elder wisdom is a resource to be treasured, not a vulnerability to be exploited." Claire demonstrated their advanced monitoring systems, now implemented in facilities across the globe. But she emphasized the human element. Technology is just a tool. The real protection comes from community awareness, from voices united in purpose. Marcus watched his mother with pride as she guided the session. The woman who had once been silenced now spoke with quiet authority, her wisdom touching lives across continents. The Silent Witnesses Foundation had become more than they could have imagined, a movement that transcended borders and generations. "Our strength," Elizabeth told the gathering, "lies not in our programs or protocols, but in our unity. Every voice that joins us adds to our collective wisdom. Every story shared strengthens our common purpose." The afternoon brought a special ceremony in the Barbara Reynolds Memorial Garden. New residents of the transformed Silver Oaks joined with advocates and community members to plant trees, living symbols of growth and renewal. "These trees," Elizabeth explained, "will grow as our movement grows. Their roots will deepen as our impact deepens. They remind us that from the smallest seed of resistance, great change can bloom." As the day progressed, the foundation hummed with activity. In one room, young interns learned from elderly mentors. In another, international delegates coordinated global initiatives. The silence that had once hidden exploitation had been transformed into a symphony of purposeful action. "You know what makes our work sustainable?" Sarah reflected, joining Elizabeth by the garden's fountain. "We didn't just create an organization, we sparked a movement that grows stronger with each voice that joins it." Elizabeth touched Barbara's locket, feeling the weight of their journey. "Because we understood that true change comes not from power over others, but from power shared among many. Every person who finds their voice here becomes part of something larger than themselves. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grounds where Elizabeth had once scrubbed floors in silence. Now those same spaces rang with voices of hope and purpose, each one adding to their collective strength. Marcus approached with the latest statistics. Thousands of lives touched, hundreds of facilities transformed, dozens of countries implementing their methods. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real impact was in the changed lives, the restored dignity, the wisdom preserved and shared. "Our work is never finished," Elizabeth told the gathered community as day turned to evening. "Each person who finds their voice here carries our message forward. Each story shared adds to our collective wisdom. Each life touched becomes part of our lasting legacy." As night fell, the lights of the Silent Witnesses Foundation glowed warmly against the darkening sky. Inside, the work continued. Advocates training, survivors healing, wisdom being shared across generations. The movement they had built had become self-sustaining, growing stronger with each passing day. Elizabeth stood in the garden one last time, surrounded by the community they had created. The silence that had once seemed so overwhelming had been transformed into something powerful, a chorus of voices rising together, each one adding to their eternal echo of strength and dignity. "We are the silent witnesses no more," she said softly, her words carrying to every corner of the garden. "We are the voices of wisdom, the guardians of dignity, the creators of change. And our song will continue, growing stronger with each voice. That joins our chorus, touching lives for generations to come." The night air carried the sound of laughter and conversation from the foundation's halls, the sweet music of voices freed from silence, of wisdom shared across generations, of strength found in unity. The movement they had built would continue growing, evolving, touching more lives with each passing day. For in the end, the Silent Witnesses had created more than just an organization or a protocol. They had sparked a revolution in how society values its wisest members, how communities protect their vulnerable, how generations connect and learn from each other. And in gardens across the world, in facilities transformed by their vision, in communities united by their purpose, their message would continue to echo. That wisdom deserves protection, that age brings not weakness but strength, that voices united can transform silence into symphony.